Chapter 51. Interlude Roman 14. The Competent Forsaken Subcommittee Roman 3. Chapter text Interlude Roman 14. The Competent Forsaken Subcommittee Roman 3. The three figures were sitting in an empty void of absolute blackness, each on a huge wooden armchair that wouldn't have looked out of place in an opulent reading room. This time there was no preamble or small talk. What the fuck is going on? Demandrid sounded furious. Semirage gave him a look. No need to be so aggressive. To be honest, I have not got much to report since last time. We are preparing for another return to the main continent. I have been, Demandrid cut her off. No, I mean in the main continent, the Western nations, Ishmael. You are going to have to enlighten me. Semirage sounded resigned to another of his rants. Fine. Demandrid brought his temper back under control after a momentary struggle. Firstly, Luz Thurin has taken the Stone of Tyr, proclaimed himself the Dragon Reborn. Hardly unexpected, Semirage replied. All part of the plan, I thought. Not part of Belel's plan, though, and now he's dead. So are almost all of the Black Sisters that Ishmael sent there. Messana's acidic tone suggested she wasn't delighted by that. Were there not 13 of them? Demandrid sounded like he genuinely was not sure, an unusual occurrence. Surely that would have been enough to deal with the boy, even with assistance. Yes, emphasis on the were. I've struggled to piece together exactly what happened, but it seems Ishmael neglected to inform them about Taija Kosola being alive. A deep scowl marred Messana's face. Ah, Semirage nodded sagely. So she with the backing of this time's Aes Sedai overwhelmed them. I suppose anyone from our time would be an unfortunate force multiplier. Right, so that is one thing. Demandrid had no intention of being deterred, but not entirely surprising. The so-called Aes Sedai fucked around, and they found out if that woman can be a threat to the weaker chosen. He clearly did not include himself in that. Then she is hardly going to struggle with them. Fine, but you would not be so worked up about that. You are not even involved with the Black Adger. Semirage frowned. So what is it that is worrying you? Demandrid sneered. Little worries me, Semirage. However, this is something I think should worry all of us. My sources tell me Ishmael is dead, Samel too, and no explanation for it. He glanced at both women. If that does not worry you, then I do not know what would. Similar methods too, that manner that Ishmael likes to use as a retreat, obliterated in fire. For Samel, the apartments he kept in Elian, exactly the same. Neither of them have been seen since. Semirage choked off a surprised exclamation. You are telling me that someone managed to kill both Ishmael and Samel by blowing up their homes. Is this some kind of joke? No joke. Do I look like I'm smiling? Belel was, well, not unexpected, but two more of us in a matter of weeks. I do not think any of the backwards channelers from this age could do it. Even Luz Thurin is a half-drained boy. He sneered at the name. Taija Kosola could do it, in theory. We all know about Falmi. But she would have had no way of finding Ishmael or Samel, and if they did not have appropriate wards, I will eat my sword. I think we all agree she is not on the level to do it through more conventional means. He winced at the idea. I do not think any of us would be stupid enough to try to kill Ishmael with the power, and Samel was hardly an easy target either. The man specialized in elaborate defenses. He paused. Why are you smiling, Messana? This isn't funny. Messana's smile widened. No, it isn't, although I can't say I'm sorry to see some of the competition eliminated. However, I'm smiling because I know something you don't. She sat back, folding her arms smugly. There was a long pause, broken eventually by Semirage's exasperated voice. Fine. Please, could you tell us what you know, Messana? Messana grinned. Their politeness isn't so hard, is it? You always said I was wasting my time speaking with Mercedian. That she's practically useless in this age. But you forget the strength and the power isn't everything. And while she may not have her old network, she still makes it her business to know what's going on. Now, I can't confirm any of this, but she told me that Taija Kosola was indeed involved with Belel's death, which is hardly surprising. She seems to have attached herself to Luz Thurin. She paused to consider, although I don't remember her ever spending much time with him before or during the war. I suppose none of us really knew her, though. Maybe she is just clinging for whatever security she can. It is not like she was ever much of a player in the game, after all. Demandrid offered. The other two shrugged at that. It was probably true. Anyway, The more interesting thing is a woman who exactly matches Greendel's description was seen around Samuel's apartments immediately before they exploded. So you think Greendel is making a play to remove the competition? Semirage leant forward. I am almost surprised. She could tear herself away from her pleasures, to be honest. I also do not see how she could have taken on Ishmael. This time Messana shrugged. I don't know. Perhaps he was injured by Luz Thurin. Again. But she smiled conspiratorially. A little spider did tell me that Greendel has been summoned to Sheol Gull to explain herself. Both Semirage and Demandred looked perturbed at the idea. Certainly not out of any sympathy for Greendel, but it was not an idea any of the Chosen would be comfortable with. Well, I, for one, will be fascinated to see what kind of a state she is in when she comes back. Despite his casual words, Demandred looked pensive. It seems that the Shadow may have just lost 3, potentially 4, of the Chosen. Ultimately, the chaff will be weeded out, but in the short term, this does severely weaken our position. We may need to take more proactive action. I suppose with Ishmael out of the picture, we can take off the kid gloves with Luz Thurin. Semirage's comment was casual, but she watched Demandred brighten up at the thought. A good point, but we will need to take care. He should not be underestimated, and he's surrounding himself with other channelers who are not insignificant. Messana spoke with the tired voice of someone who felt themselves having to be the voice of reason all too often. You want to go after him and find yourself with Taija Kosola spinning balefire behind you, or go after her and find Luz Thurin is there, or a circle of 13 of this age's Aes Sedai. He may just be an untrained boy at the moment, but he also seems to have managed to defeat both Ajna and Ishmael unassisted and walked straight through one of Belal's nets. HMPH, Demandred just snorted, but he was never going to do more than that to admit that she was correct. Very well, we all have much to think on. Until next time. He did not wait for their nods before vanishing. Chapter 52. Unpleasant Discoveries. Chapter text, chapter Roman 36. Unpleasant discoveries. Despite what Taija had said about its dangers, Egwene kept on finding herself in Teleranhyard. She could normally stop herself from going there when she fell asleep. Taija's advice had worked, if only partially, but that didn't stop her desire to explore her new-found abilities. She was very sure Taija hadn't meant to implicitly encourage her to visit more, but her explanation of how things worked there made everything so much easier. Egwene still struggled to control her clothing and surroundings, but just knowing that it was a matter of will and focus at least gave her something to work on. Tonight, she decided she was going to look at the ale waste. She wanted to see where these strange people had come from. Elaine had told her some of what she knew about it, but much of it seemed to be beyond credibility. She closed her eyes and focused, bringing her desire to see the waste to the forefront of her mind. A flicker and she found herself somewhere else. Small, scrub-like plants were dotted around, but most of what she saw was just achingly dry dirt. Most, except for the woman dressed like the ale maiden warriors stalking towards a boar, spear in hand. Egwene must have made a sound, because the woman suddenly froze and looked towards her. She waited a moment, expecting the woman to vanish like everyone else here seemed to, but instead she raised her spear and took a step towards her. Wait, I mean you no harm." She gasped the words out. The woman looked like she was about to launch the spear straight through her. Egwene focused for a second, transforming her clothes into ale ones to match what the woman wore. Her reward was a look of distaste. "You have no right to wear cadencer, girl." The woman didn't do anything, but Egwene's clothes vanished, leaving her standing there naked as the day she was born. Outrage flared in her, and with a thought she brought her own clothes back, the dress she'd been wearing before, though not the cadencer, and made the other woman's disappear. With a suddenly wary frown, the ale woman brought her own clothes back, different now though, a white blouse and brown skirts. "Are you from the White Tower?" "I am Amy's of the 9 Valleys, sept of the Tarded Ale." Was this one of the ale's wise ones? "You're a wise one, of course you are, and you're a dreamer." She mastered her excitement and put on her most composed face. "I am Egwene Ulver," she breathed in nervously. "I am Aes Sedai." She noticed a flicker of something in Amy's face. "What are you doing here, Egwene Ulver?" "I was." Egwene tried to sound confident and serene, like Moiraine always did. "I was exploring Teleranhyard, seeking to learn its mysteries." Amy's gave her a flat look. You may be Aes Sedai, but in the world of dreams you are an arrogant child. You should not be here. I admit I am only starting to learn its secrets. You could be of great assistance. Egwene tried not to sound too eager. Amy snorted. I cannot teach you here. If you wish to learn, you will learn properly. Come to the threefold land. I can be found at Cold Rock's Hold. I will spread word through the clans that an Aes Sedai named Egwene Ulver may have safe passage. I am at Rhuidean now, but I will have returned by the time you can be there. Egwene resisted the urge to gasp with excitement, instead settling for a dignified nod. Thank you, Amy's. However, I can be at Rhuidean or Cold Rock's Hold within a day or two. May I come to you at Rhuidean? Amy's frowned at her. The city of Rhuidean is off limits to all outsiders. To enter it without permission is death. After a second, she seemed to relent, though. But I will show you my camp near the city. You may come to me there, as long as you give me your word you will not attempt to go to Rhuidean itself. I said I cannot lie, correct? Egwene nodded quickly. Yes, you have my word. Deep in the bowels of the stone Taija once more stood in the dark. Dingy room full of almost useless Turangreal looking up at the twisted red stone doorway. She didn't know anywhere near as much as she'd like about this, but she knew enough. She needed answers. No frivolous questions, no questions that touched on the shadow. Such simple rules, but she'd heard enough about what happened to people who broke them, whether accidentally or deliberately. Taija shuddered. If she wasn't so far out of her depth, flailing around without any real purpose beyond misery, there'd be no way she'd risk this. There were good reasons why she'd sat the girls down before coming here and explained what she was going to do and exactly how dangerous it was. She'd also strictly forbidden them from going through the doorway even if they were inclined to do so, which they'd insisted they weren't. With a deep breath, Taija stepped through the doorway. For an infinite moment, all she saw was blinding light. Then suddenly, she was in a large chamber, lit by what might be electric lights, with strange columns twisting up to support the ceiling. Taija took another deep breath. She'd already decided on the questions she was going to ask, but in her time, there had been a whole group of experts dedicated to this. Before anyone was allowed through the doorway, their questions would be vetted, double-checked for their own protection. Even then, it still wasn't considered safe. Not just any idiot was allowed to go in and ask whatever they felt like. Today, circumstances forced her to be that idiot. She jumped when she heard a sibilant, reedy voice speak behind her. Even as Taija whirled to face it, she stopped herself from embracing Sedar. She had to be careful there. She thought she knew the rules, but really all she knew was from reading a couple of academic articles on the doorways, which were rather more focused on the physics of it all than the treaties with the Aelfin. She probably knew more about the strange ways space and time were twisted there than she did about the rules of interacting with the Aelfin. The risks of getting something wrong were terrifyingly high. One of the Aelfin stood before her, black slit eyes, elongated form just like the pictures. It has been a long time, and yet once again seekers come to us. Taija was sure she could see movement out of the corner of your eye among the columns. Good. You have brought no lamps, no torches, as the agreement was, and is, and ever will be. You have no iron, no instruments of music. Its accent was distinctly odd. Taija nearly asked who else had been through the doorway and then remembered herself. No, I have none. I am here for answers. Take me to where I can receive them. Her words were measured, careful, but her heart was pounding in her chest. The elfin gestured for Taija to follow and began to walk. She hurried after him. This place have her the shivers. It seemed to be a gigantic palace, but there was something badly wrong with everything. Buildings curved impossibly. There were no straight lines. Everything was twisted. Despite her discomfort, Taija half wished she could spend a week there with a proper research team. The basics were well understood, but there was so much more to discover. Of course, the Aelfin would never allow that. Eventually, her guide brought her to a large, ornate archway, its carved form uncomfortable to even look at, and gestured inside. Your answers lie within. Before turning to leave, he leant in, opened his mouth wide, and inhaled at her. It was deeply uncomfortable, reminding her a bit too much of the first time she met Ardmarsenal, and Taija had to clamp down on the urge to throw him away from her with the power. Suppressing a shudder, she stepped through the archway. Mosaics formed strange patterns in the floor, ones that made her feel nauseous when she tried to look at them. However, what was important was the three spiraled pedestals in front of her. One of the Aelfin sat on top of each of them. clad in faded robes. "Welcome, questioner. It has been a long time. Ask according to the ancient agreement, ask." They spoke together. Taija gave herself a nod and recited her first question. "Thank you for your guidance, honored Aelfin. My first question is, how can I best help Randall Thor and Alexei Durkarel to learn to channel Sedin safely?" One of the articles she'd read had said that trying to lawyer questions to force an overly specific answer would often be treated as frivolous by the Aelfin, so she was trying to keep her questions simple and to the point. "You must allow yourself to be blind." The first of Aelfin, on the left-hand pedestal, spoke without hesitation. A deep bell tolled somewhere nearby, and the three Aelfin inhaled sharply. Taija inclined her head in thanks, despite having no idea what they meant by that. She'd think about it later. "My second question is, how can I best help Egwene Ulver to learn to dreamwalk safely?" This time it was the Aelfin on the middle pedestal that answered immediately. The young bird must be permitted to fly the nest. The bell tolled a second time, and once more they breathed in, shivering in apparent pleasure. Again, Taija nodded her thanks, thoroughly creeped out. That answer was much clearer, unusually so in fact. She strongly suspected it meant Egwene would get an opportunity, and she'd need to let her take it without interference. Taija's final question was the most difficult to decide on. There had been a few options. In the end, though, she decided she needed people you could rely on, both for her own good and to help with the light. "My final question is, who is the most powerful Aes Sedai that I would safely learn to trust with my life?" The light seemed to flicker for a second, and all three Elfin leaned forward, their eyes black slits. The room suddenly felt far more oppressive. Terror spiked within her. Taija had thought this would be a safe question, avoiding any mention of the Black Adger, and being wide enough not just to be seen as an attempt at getting round it. But she hadn't been completely sure. There was a silence that drew out for agonizing seconds, until the third Elfin broke it. "Tread carefully, seeker of mysteries." His voice was a low, angry hiss. "You shall see her stand, untouched by your wrath, yet anger may lead to trust." The bell tolled a third time, and once again they inhale. "Thank you for your forbearance." Taija apologized carefully, trying not to shiver at how close she just came to the line. She'd read enough about some of the consequences they could inflict just for trying to get around their rules to have absolutely no desire to try. "Your questions have been answered. Leave." All three turned their backs on her, their displeasure obvious, and four more Aelfin seemed to appear around Taija out of nowhere, quickly hustling her out of the room. It was clear that they wanted her gone. They weren't friendly when she'd arrived, but now she was met by scowls and practically having to jog to avoid being shoved by them. Taija's journey out of the strange palace was far more direct than her entrance, and before she knew it, she was stumbling out of the doorway back into the dingy room. A couple of days after her visit to the doorway, Egwene stayed to talk to Taija after a lesson with the other girls, looking nervous about something. Taija hoped it was nothing serious. She already had a lot on her mind. In particular, she was worried about Elaine. She hadn't taken Matt's revelations about Lord Gibril at all well. Taija had her suspicions about who he was, and she was starting to think about a suitable way to deal with him if they were correct. But that was small comfort for Elaine. How could it be? How could someone deal with being told that their mother might be in the hands of one of the Forsaken, and that if they tried to rescue her, the most likely outcome was that they would be gracing the monstrous man's bed in turn? Taija tried not to shudder at the thought, and gave Egwene her attention. "What's bothering you, Egwene? I can see something is." She gave her an encouraging smile. Egwene looked nervously at her feet. "I've been invited to go to Ruidian." "What exactly is Ruidian, and who has invited you?" Taija was a little confused, but a suspicion was growing in her. "It's a place in the Ale Waste. I've been invited there by a wise one to learn how to dreamwalk." Of course she had. "How exactly did you receive this invitation?" Taija's voice was dry. "I met her in the unseen world." At least she had the decency to blush. Taija wanted to groan at her headstrong idiocy. Light save her from teenagers who thought they were invincible. "I see." Taija let her stew for a long moment, but she could hardly forget the second answer she got from the Aelfin, the only one that seemed to make any sense. "You do realize how foolish you were. I'm disappointed in you for ignoring my advice." Her face fell. "I'm sorry, Taija said I." Taija sighed. "But you do need a teacher to learn to dreamwalk. as you clearly don't have the self-discipline to restrain yourself. We're going to have a good talk about this, and about making sure you're safe there, but I will allow you to go." It went against every instinct she had to let her run off to light knows where. The easy solution would be for Taija to go with her. It would be an adventure for the other two to see this ale waste. But the elfin's words echoed back in her head. Taking the nest with her would hardly count. A day after Egwene left, Moiraine came to Taija's rooms. She was as serene as ever, but there was a tightness around her eyes, and she spun a web against eavesdropping around the room when Taija closed the door behind her. It was unexpected. Normally the two of them avoided each other unless they needed something. It was an arrangement that had worked well enough. "Taija," said I must speak with you." Taija was curious, if nothing else. "Of course," Moiraine said, "what's this about?" She didn't beat around the bush. "Are you aware that Alexei can channel?" Taija blinked, surprised. "Well, yes, of course. I've asked Rand to help train him as well as he can to make sure he doesn't end up hurting himself." She wasn't really sure she saw why Moiraine was raising this. "I know he is important to you, but you do know what that means, do you not?" Taija could tell she was trying to project sympathy, although she wasn't very good at it. "I know there's a very real level of prejudice against male channelers nowadays, yes." Moiraine sighed, a hint of exasperation in her tone. "It is not prejudice. Every man who channels is cursed. They will go mad and they will die. It might be weeks, it might be months, or it might in rare cases be years, but there is no escape." "So I've heard." Taija's voice was dry, but worry was curdling in her belly. Moiraine certainly believed it, even if she thought it was ridiculous. "I haven't seen any evidence for it, though. Where are all the madmen, destroying and killing as they go? I know the statistics, what proportion of the population can channel. They should be everywhere." "Are you sure your statistics," Moiraine stumbled a little over the word, "are still valid in this age? Many eyes said I believe that the ability to channel is being bred out of the population. It may be much less common than you think." It was true that that hadn't occurred to Taija. "Wherever male channelers are found, they are gentled. The Red Adger devotes itself to this, and all eyes said I will assist, because it is a mercy. A mercy to them and to everyone around them, because they will go mad, and they will kill those they love." Moiraine leant forward, emphasizing her words like she was trying to force her to understand. "What's your point?" Taija knew she was being defensive, but she didn't like what Moiraine was suggesting about Alexei. She didn't like it at all. "My point is that you need to be aware of the consequences of letting a male channeler go free. Not only for himself, but also for everyone around him. Why are you coming to me about Alexei and not Rand?" She was being deliberately unhelpful, but Taija was thoroughly annoyed by her. "For light's sake, you stupid woman, do you think it's not a concern for Rand too? But he is the dragon reborn. We have no choice. Mad or not, we need him to face the Dark One at Shael Gull. Alexei is not." For once, Moiraine's composure cracked. Oh, now Taija understand where she was going with this, or she thought she did, and she really didn't like it. "I see." Taija stood meeting her eye to eye. She was actually slightly taller than Moiraine, not something she could say about many people. "Well, let me be clear with you. If you lay a hand on Alexei, if you try to sever him, or, light forbid, succeed, it will be the last thing you do because I will kill you." Taija didn't change her tone as she delivered the threat. There was no need for her to be dramatic. It wasn't her style. Both of them knew she meant every word. Moiraine looked at her for a second, her eyes searching for any sign of weakness, and then without another word she got up and stormed out. Good riddance. It was another worry to add to her list, though. For all that her first instinct was to dismiss anything Moiraine said that she didn't like, she was a knowledgeable woman who shouldn't be able to tell a lie. She could, of course, be wrong, but if Taija was honest with herself, it seemed unlikely. Regardless, there was no way that she would let her sever Alexei. That was a death sentence, but she needed to start thinking about this properly. Whatever happened, she'd protect both him and Rand, possibly even from themselves. Elaine took a deep breath and kept her face composed. She was not happy that she was here. The realm of the Aelfin was worse than Taija had described to her. Just looking around gave her a headache, and the way these people behaved, the way they looked at her, terrified her. Nearly as much as she feared Taija's reaction if or when she found out Elaine had disobeyed her and come here. Then there was Matt. They'd agreed to go in together, and yet as soon as she stepped into that light, he was gone, leaving her alone with the Aelfin. She could only hope that he was well and just separated from her. However, she was the daughter heir of Andor, and she knew her duty. She would not show weakness or fear. Raising her chin, she asked her first question of the three Aelfin in front of her. Will I be able to become Aes Sedai if I take my training from Taija Kosola? The Seeker of Mysteries may name you one. She was surprised at how quickly the answer came. She'd thought hard about her next question, remembering what Taija had said about questions that touched on the shadow. She'd very carefully worded it to avoid any mention of Lord Gibril. If it didn't mention him, then it couldn't touch on the shadow. It was just a question of politics. How can I help my mother to keep the throne of Andor? The room darkened and the lights flickered. Suddenly the Aelfin seemed to be leaning forward, an oppressive feel in the air. Did they somehow look angry? Turn the wolves away. Leave her to her own affairs. She will keep it. The words were spat this time, dismissive disgust in them. Rage flared in Elaine. They knew what she'd meant. Trying to twist their way out of answering. Didn't they know how important this was? Fine. She'd rephrase it. She wasn't stupid, though. She wouldn't mention Lord Gibril. How can I help my mother to regain control of Andor? For a moment the lights went out, and Elaine had to stifle a shriek in the darkness. When sight returned to her, the pedestals were empty. It took her a second to realize the three Aelfin were in front of her, looming far too close for comfort. Their eyes drilled into her as they pressed forward, pushing her back towards the back of the room. They seemed to be practically vibrating with tension as they began to speak, one after the other, their voices angry hisses. The worthy daughter thinks she is clever. Sophistry used against us. Twisting words, twisting the rules. She knows what she truly asks. We know what she truly asks. Elaine's eyes flicked from one to the other with growing fear as she took another step back. She must be punished. Asks us to speak of the forbidden. The punishment can only be death. Death. All three of them spoke at once in a sibilant hiss. They pressed in closer, leaning into her space, forcing her backwards as she desperately looked for an escape. Their steps were quickening, as were their voices. Please, I meant no offense. Elaine frantically reached for Sedar, only to find it slipping through her fingers. Something was not right with it in this place. Disappointment entered their voices. The treaty still holds. She did not ask directly. The rules are clear. The treaty does not permit it. Elaine breathed a deep sigh of relief, even as her back hit the wall. May I go? She managed to stammer. She was never going to disobey Taija again. She wishes to leave. Mocking laughter seemed to echo through the room. She did not ask directly, and yet she sought to deceive us, to twist her words. She must be punished. She will have her answer, but she will pay the price. There was a pause in their voices, as if they were conferring silently, but before Elaine could plead with them, they suddenly spoke in unison. There are three. Find the one who runs with wolves. Send him to the enslaved mother to gain your desire. All three Aelfin inhaled deeply, and without warning she found rough hands seizing her from behind, where there had been solid wall a moment before. Let me go, she shrieked, struggling to pull free from grips that could have been made of iron. The three Aelfin ignored her cries, drawing wickedly curved daggers from their belts and speaking one at a time, even faster than before. You have your answer as is written in the treaties. But there must be a price, equal payment for equal offense. The worthy daughter protects the enslaved mother. You shall have no daughters of your own. Your line shall end with you. So shall it be done. The price shall be paid. Their faces suddenly split into hungry grins, mouths full of too many teeth, as they leant forward, daggers descending. Elaine could do nothing but scream in agony as the first blade stabbed into her abdomen. Chapter 53. Unpleasant Discoveries, Part Roman 2. Chapter text, Chapter Roman 37. Unpleasant Discoveries, Part Roman 2. Taija was talking with Rand when Matt burst into the room without even knocking, looking thoroughly disheveled. Taija said he panted, holding onto the doorframe. It is Elaine. She has need of you. He was clearly a bit of a mess, and Taija ignored the odd look Rand gave him. Calm down, Matt. What's wrong? He'd been avoiding her since the stone had fallen pretty successfully. She suspected Elaine had been helping him do it, although she hadn't quite worked out how. Much as Taija wanted to spend time with someone who could speak her language, she didn't want to force herself on the boy, and it had been kind of amusing half-heartedly trying to catch them out. Elaine, she is hurt badly. She needs you. Fuck. She sprang to her feet. Where is she? What happened? The room with the Turangriel, the doorway. He trailed off as he saw the anger on her face, but Taija was already spinning a gateway, stepping through it, thankful that the wards she'd put up only prevented traveling in and out of the stone. As Taija stepped through the gateway, she spun air and fire into a bright ball of light to illuminate the room, and immediately saw Elaine in a crumpled heap beside the twisted redstone doorway. Her hands were pressed over her abdomen, and there was a lot of blood. Too much blood. Fuck. Rand and Matt had followed her through the gateway, and she allowed it to close before opening another to just outside Moirin's quarters. Rand, fetch Moirin now. Drag her if you have to. I'll keep the gateway open. She paused for a moment. The girl was hardly experienced, but it might help. She had a real talent after all. Then fetch Nynaeve. Taija opened a second gateway. Go. Rand, light bless him, leapt through the first gateway without questioning her, and she turned back to Elaine tying both gateways off. The girl seemed to be fading in and out of consciousness, her eyes glassy. There really was a lot of blood. It was lucky she wasn't squeamish. Get your ass over here right now, Taija snapped at Matt. I'm going to need your help. She shrugged off her coat and held it up in a web of air before using another web to rapidly slice it into strips. As she worked, she asked him, "What the fuck happened here?" Taija ignored his wince at the rapid power-aided disassembly of her coat. I had heard about the doorway from a book. She could already tell he was lying about that. Elaine probably told him. I'm going to try to heal her. Hold these. Taija handed him the strips of cloth that were all that remained of her coat. It was a nice coat, too, and put her hands onto Elaine's, feeling the warm, slippery blood coating them. She formed a web for battlefield healing and poured every ounce of Sedar that she could channel into it, a huge amount of the power with her angriel. As the web sank into her, Elaine sat up with a gasp and then flopped back again. Taija thought she might look slightly less pale, but she was still bleeding. Matt looked like he wanted to run away, but she wasn't having that. I'm going to hold her up. You need to wrap the cloth around her tightly. We need pressure to stop the bleeding so that she can survive until Moirin or Nynaeve gets here. Not for the first time in her life, Taija cursed her lack of talent with healing. She didn't know why she'd never been able to heal effectively. It was just a web to be analyzed like any other, but it was what it was. Matt nodded as Taija gently lifted Elaine, using Sedar to avoid moving her any more than she had to. The puddle of blood on the floor around her was alarmingly large. What in the light did she ask the Aelfin, stupid, foolish girl? After a brief flurry of work, there was nothing more the two of them could do other than wait. So, placing her now blood-covered hand on Elaine's, Taija fixed Matt with her best stare. You were telling me what happened. He shifted uncomfortably. It was Lord Gibril. You know what I told her and who he is. She couldn't bear thinking about it. She needed to do something, but she knew you were right, and she couldn't just go and remove him herself. I told her about the doorway. Taija sighed internally. It was kind of sweet that he was trying to protect her, but if Elaine survived this, she was going to be furious with both of them. We agreed that we would go through together, but we planned the questions. We are not fools. We knew the rules. So she asked about Lord Gibril. No, we agreed. She would ask about how to help her mother and not mention Lord Gibril. That way the question would avoid the shadow. He seemed desperate to convince her, despite the evidence lying in front of them. Taija shook her head. Trying to play word games with the Aelfin doesn't end well. She glanced down at Elaine, her stomach twisting. Please let her survive this. She's lucky to. Taija trailed off, not wanting to finish. What did you ask, Matt? Shook his head vigorously. Nothing. They threw me out immediately. Another obvious lie, but before Taija could call him on it, Moirin and Rand burst into the room only for Rand to run out again through the second gateway. Moirin was all business, practically shoving Taija and Matt aside, the power lighting up around her as she drew through her angriel. She placed her hands on Elaine's head, and a storm of Sedar flowed out of her. Spirit, water and air flowing together in an incredibly powerful healing weave. Elaine seemed to shudder violently, and Taija could see the wound visibly knitting over, but still seeping blood. After a second, Moirin slumped, taking her hands off Elaine. I have done what I can, but I fear it may not be enough. She has lost a lot of blood, and the internal damage is extensive. I hope that. She was cut off by Rand returning, this time with Nynaeve. Thank the Creator he found her quickly. She glanced around and saw the three of them kneeling around Elaine. Light, what has that fool girl done now? Despite her words, she didn't hesitate to kneel down by Elaine, muttering angrily to herself. A second later, the light of Sedar sprang up around her, and a far more complicated five-element healing web appeared up in a storm of light around the girl. Taija had no idea how Nynaeve had worked that out. She didn't think anyone in this time had taught her. She certainly hadn't. Taija had known Nynaeve had a talent for healing, but this was clearly proper healing like she'd expect from a restorer, not the crude webs better suited for battlefield first aid that Moiraine and other modern Aes Sedai used. When the light of Sedar faded from around Nynaeve, Elaine looked much better, some color returning to her cheeks. Will she be all right? Taija was dreading the answer. If she'd been punished by the Aelfin, then a simple stabbing was unlikely to be all that was involved. She looked down at the poor girl, trying not to bite her lip nervously. Moiraine just looked to Nynaeve, who looked uncomfortable and upset. She'll live, but it's hard. I thought the injuries were random, but everything has healed adequately except for her womb. I don't think there's anything I can do about that. Taija winced. So she can't have children. Nynaeve shook her head, and Taija's heart went out to Elaine, previous anger extinguished in painful sympathy. Even Moiraine looked perturbed, although she was probably just thinking about how this would impact on Andoran politics or something cold-blooded like that. Even with the power to heal her, it took a couple of days for Elaine to be well enough to get out of bed. Taija's anger at her stupidity was long gone. She was just a teenager, and teenagers did stupid things. Also, it wasn't like she hadn't suffered enough for her actions. Taija couldn't deny that she'd done plenty of stupid things under stress, without even having the excuse of age. It did distress her, though. Things were bad enough during the war, but people seemed to be expected to grow up so terribly young in this time. Taija spent more time than she really should have going to see Elaine, given her other responsibilities. She was clearly horrifically upset, understandably so, and underlying it all was a strand of guilt and fear when she saw Taija. More than once Taija found herself rubbing her back while she clung onto her, tearfully mumbling about how sorry she was into her chest. "I'm sorry, Taija," said I should have listened to you, but I needed to know. "It's all right, Elaine. I'm sorry that it happened. But you'll be okay. You're a strong young lady. Lord Gibril will get his comeuppance, I promise you." Taija made the promise to herself, too. Whether he was who she thought or not, she'd make sure of that, even if no one else would. Elaine did, of course, tell her what questions she'd asked, but she was completely stumped by the answer that the Aelfin gave her, until Taija pointed out that Rand, Mat and Perrin were 3 taverns, so maybe it was them. Elaine's eye brightened up a bit. "Oh, Mat told me." Just as quickly she clammed up completely. "Never mind, but I am sure it's Perrin." Now that was a mystery for Taija. Even with Mat doing his best to avoid her, Perrin was the one of the 3 that she knew the least well. If she was honest with herself, she found him rather boring. He always seemed to be brooding in the background rather than doing anything that caught her interest. Kind of a typical teenager, actually. Taija stopped herself before she got caught up in speculation. The boy's secrets were his to keep, and she didn't want to push Elaine to break a confidence. "So you think Perrin needs to be the one to save your mother?" Elaine nodded firmly. "It is the only answer that makes sense with what the Aelfin said." "Fine," Taija shrugged. "I can make him a gateway to Keemlin if that's what he wants." "You're not recovered enough," she added before Elaine could protest. A day later, she was spinning a gateway for Perrin and the Agia loyal to just outside Keemlin, wishing them the best of luck. Elaine was oddly reluctant to discuss what he'd be doing with Taija, but she supposed that was her prerogative. Taija was just left wondering what in the light Perrin had to do with wolves. While he was quite hairy, he didn't look like one at all. Once Elaine was sufficiently recovered, Taija kept herself occupied teaching her and Nynaeve and talking with Rand. During her time with the girls, she found that she was missing Egwene. She really had grown fond of her, and Taija could feel her absence. She'd promised herself that she'd leave the girl to forge her own path for a while, however difficult it might be to let her go at a young age. But Taija decided that if she hadn't heard anything from Egwene after a couple of months, she was going to go and check on her, dedicated hostility to outsiders or not. Now that Rand was also ruling a kingdom, he seemed even more stressed and worried. It wasn't really surprising. Taija did her best to offer him what comfort she could, but her best guesses at medieval politics were more than lacking. She knew he was also getting advice from Moiraine and Elaine, and she had no doubt theirs was much more useful. As a result, Taija put more effort into talking to him about philosophy, ethics, and what it meant to be an Aes Sedai. At least those were things that she could talk knowledgeably about, and which were valuable for a young channeler to learn. However, it was only a couple of days after she'd helped Perrin on Elaine's mission that Rand started asking unexpected questions. Questions which completely changed things for Taija. It all started fairly innocuously. "Taija, I was wondering, what exactly is it that you did before the War of Power?" She blinked, surprised at the question. No one had actually asked her that before, not even Alexei. It was more than a bit sad, really. Well over 100 years of work relegated to irrelevance. She sniffed and tried to move on from the thought. Taija realized it was actually quite hard to explain to someone from this time. "I was a physicist." Her tone was a little lost, her eyes distant. It was difficult to describe how much she missed it. So many years spent fighting when really she wanted to be in her office or in a lab researching, discovering. Rand gave her a blank look, so Taija tried to elaborate. "I studied the way the world worked at a fundamental level, the forces and tiniest parts that bind it together and make the wheel turn." Rand looked at her like she just confirmed a suspicion he had. "So you used the one power in your studies and looked at how it worked?" Taija shrugged a bit awkwardly. There were too many memories. "Sure, I suppose so. That was part of it." He nodded to himself. "But there was no taint on Sedin in your time." "Well, no, of course not." Taija was wondering where he was going with it. Since her conversation with Moirin, she'd given a bit more thought to the apparent taint on Sedin, but she hadn't had much time for it. Perhaps that had been a mistake. After a moment, Taija focused her eyes on his. "Rand, can you describe the taint for me? All I've heard is that male channelers go mad, but I haven't seen much to support that being anything more than prejudice." Moiraine was going on about it too, and I suppose she should know. He looked surprised at that. "Taija, the taint is real. I feel it every time I channel." Rand seemed to close in on himself a bit. "It's like a foul slick of filth on pure Sedin, and every time I seize the power I'm bathing in it." His eyes were widening with remembered disgust. "The filth just covers me. It fills every pore and I want to vomit. But I can't. I just want to channel more Sedin even while I'm covered in its foulness." He seemed surprised he'd said that much. Taija was surprised too, surprised and shocked. "Rand," her voice was soft. "Why didn't you tell me before?" He looked embarrassed. "Well, you never asked. Maybe I should have." Her mind was drawn inevitably back to her conversation with Moirin, the woman's deadly seriousness about Alexei's fate and her own refusal to even consider it. Taija let out a hiss of exasperation. This was unacceptable. "Is everything all right? Are you all right?" Rand eventually spoke up after she'd been lost in thought for a while. He really was a sweet boy. "Yes, I'm fine." Taija didn't want to, but she was going to have to do it. "I need to understand this better. We need to find Nynaeve or Elaine." Before Rand could protest, she'd spun a gateway to their apartments and was stepping through it, urging him after her. "Come on, Rand." As it happened, Nynaeve was away, but she easily found Elaine, who was in her room with Matt. As soon as Taija and Rand turned up, he made his excuses and left, but that was fine. She didn't need him for this. Taija wasn't interested in Elaine's irritation at being bothered. All she cared about right now was the taint, so she just ignored it. "Elaine, I need to make a link and I need to be guiding the flows." Linking was bad enough without having someone else leading the link, but in this case, Taija was telling the truth. She needed to be the one feeling this. "Do you know how to link?" Her question was aimed at Rand, and unsurprisingly, he didn't. Taija stifled a frustrated sigh at the way it was slowing her down and started to explain. Eventually, she thought he had it, and she formed the link, starting with Elaine, and then adding Rand afterwards to ensure that she stayed in control throughout. Taija did her best to ignore the sensations she felt from them and just focused on the power. As soon as Rand was in the link, she drew on Sedin through him. It had been a while. The last man she linked with was Tell. Even then, he would have to lead when it was just the two of them. Sedin felt just as Taija remembered, raging, violent, needing to be dominated, except for the oily slick of filth on top of it. What the fuck? Rand's description underplayed how disgusting it felt. Drastically. How could he be channeling this foulness on a daily basis? How was he not screaming or vomiting every time he channeled? Taija didn't even notice herself shudder. She was exploring the feeling of the taint, the way it interacted with Sedin, swirling across the webs and sliding into through Rand. It was vile. It was fascinating. Perhaps if she manipulated the flows just so, eventually Taija noticed the other two were getting twitchy. She wasn't sure how long it had been. She'd been so focused. With a mumbled apology, Taija released the power and fled. She needed to think. Over the next couple of days, beyond teaching the girls, that was close to all she did. Taija was fast asleep, dreaming. She was eating noodles in a hole-in-the-wall place in Jalanda that did a wonderfully spicy combination of pork and peppers when she remembered she had exams the next day and she hadn't even started revising. Taija panicked. She wasn't ready. She was going to fail and disappoint everyone. She jolted into wakefulness, gasping for a few seconds as she tried to work out where she was. Were those bells? Why were they ringing? There was nothing to celebrate, was there? What about her exam? It took her far too long to come awake properly and realize that they were alarm bells. When she did, adrenaline surged through her, a jolt of energy helping Taija to throw herself out of bed and scramble for at least the outer layers of her clothing and some boots. Now she could feel the filth that was shadow spawn somewhere nearby, and there was shouting coming from outside her room. Taija was still pulling on her left boot when, with a loud crash, her door was broken in, and the bestial form of a Trolloc leapt through the gap, already raising an axe to swing at her. She didn't need to think. Sedai flowed through her, and a web of air smashed the Trolloc through a tapestry and into the stone wall behind it with a sickening crunch. Another two were already following it, though Taija could hear screams from outside. Her mind was cold, analytical like it always was in combat. There was no time for emotion, no time for the worries about the taint that had been plaguing her every waking moment she spoke to Rand. Again she spun air, a wall of it, blasting the two Trollocs, along with the remains of her door, back into the corridor outside. The path clear, Taija stepped out after them into frozen chaos. It seemed that her attacker's exit caused a brief distraction. Before the fighting, murdering, and pillaging could resume, she was channeling. She couldn't afford to let any of them get close to her. A Trolloc spear could kill her just as dead as balefire. Taija spun Sedar, and the Trollocs closest to her simply exploded. A Myrddraal further down the corridor hissed a command, and more howling Trollocs charged. A poor servant was cut down as she tried to get out of their way. The Myrddraal shouldn't have drawn Taija's attention. A simple web of fire turned it into a guttering torch. The Trollocs' charge descended into a bloody mess as she forced webs of air down the corridor, razor-sharp discs of spinning away from her. Taija's instincts shouted a warning, and she whirled to face the other direction. Lightning fast, she caught a spear in midair, no more than a meter from her. For a brief moment, the Trolloc looked confused, and then it died like the others. She needed to find the others, probably Rand. This clearly wasn't targeted at her, or they would have made a better try. Rand, on the other hand, Taija broke into a brisk, uneven walk. Her missing boot made it uncomfortable, but there was no time to go back. She didn't run. It was too dangerous to run somewhere like this. She could find herself right in the middle of a group of Trollocs or Myrddraal before she could do anything about it. It wasn't long before Taija came across a squad of defenders of the stone, a few dead Trollocs at their feet, looking around themselves fearfully. Their sergeant gave her a disapproving look. "Get back to your rooms and hide, woman." Taija supposed she didn't look like much, wearing one boot, half dressed in men's clothing with her hair all over the place. Stupid of him, though. She ignored his command and snapped, "Follow me. We go to aid the Lord Dragon." It felt odd referring to Rand that way. He looked like he was going to ignore her, which would be a pity. She could do with some people to watch her back, but she didn't have time to argue. Then a group of Trollocs came charging out of a side corridor. Even as the defenders were trying to reorient themselves and get their spears between them and the Trollocs, Taija was spinning webs of water, fire, and spirit. Each Trolloc they touched exploded like they'd swallowed a grenade. In a matter of seconds, they were all dead. The sergeant's face paled, and he immediately dropped to one knee. "My apologies, Aes Sedai. I did not realize." Impatiently, she cut him off. "It's fine. Now either follow or don't." Like the others, Nynaeve had woken up to the sound of the alarm bells. The first thing she'd done was check on Elaine. The poor girl had hardly left her room other than for lessons, and she needed to make sure that she wasn't in danger. Fortunately, Elaine had been wide awake too, already dressed by the time Nynaeve reached her. That was when they'd heard the screams, shouting and grunts and roars. Words hadn't been needed, they'd been moving immediately, Sedar flooding through both of them. They'd been fighting for a while, helping groups of defenders, and Ale while they tried to make their way towards Rand's apartments. A group of Trollocs came into view ahead of her, clashing in a melee with some defenders of the stone, easily pushing them back. Nynaeve channeled, spinning a web of air between the thrusting Trolloc spears and the defenders' shields. At the same time, Elaine spun a gateway, stepping through it to bombard the Trollocs with fire from behind. In seconds the Trollocs were dead, and the wool-headed soldiers were staring at them like cows waiting to be milked. "Well, come on then," she snapped. "The stone won't defend itself." That seemed to break them out of their reverie, and with a series of bows and yes, Aes Sedai, they pulled themselves together. It was all typical of soldiers, really, running around thinking with the hair on their chests, and then letting themselves get all worked up when they faced something really frightening. More Trollocs came running, with a pair of Myrddraal among them, and Nynaeve spun fire, air and spirit cutting them apart in conjunction with Elaine's own web. The soldiers were barely having to do any work at all, not that they were complaining. No point asking a man to do a woman's work. They rounded a corner into a huge chamber to see more shadow spawn, a larger group with several Myrddraal leading it. Nynaeve started to spin a web of fire when Elaine grabbed her arm and pointed, "Wait, there's a man there." She wanted to snap at the fool girl for slowing her down, but Elaine was right. Standing with his back to them, facing the shadow spawn, was a lone man. What in the light was he doing? She didn't want to accidentally kill him. "Run, you fool." She shouted as loudly as she could, and he whirled to face them, turning his back on the Trollocs, the idiot. He was as tall as some of the ale, wearing a tight shirt with short sleeves that emphasized his well-muscled body. He appeared to have shaved his head other than a short, neatly kept beard and mustache. He also wore what seemed to be shaded glass over his eyes, although Nynaeve couldn't think of any reason why he would do that. How could he even see properly? Why were the shadow spawn leaving rather than attacking him? When his eyes settled on Nynaeve, and Elaine, his eyebrows briefly rose behind those odd lenses, and then his forehead furrowed into a scowl. A second later, something hammered at her connection to Sedar. The man was channeling. Nynaeve spun fire and spirit to slice his web, flailing a little at the unseen contest. There was momentary resistance, and then the attempted shield vanished. She had a moment to glance at Elaine, and then they were both sprinting apart, creating distance between themselves. She could only hope the soldiers with them weren't stupid enough to try to join this fight. She spun earth and fire, sending a web into the stone floor beneath his feet at the same time as sending a dramatic fireball rocketing towards him, a touch of air in the web making it look far bigger and more threatening. She could feel Elaine channeling to her right too, flashing light, connecting her to the man. Her heart sank as he seemed more irritated than concerned, and both their webs were sliced before they could reach him. His retaliation was like a hammer blow. Nynaeve briefly tried to meet it head-on with a barrier of Sedar, but it was brushed aside like it wasn't even there, leaving her desperately throwing herself out of its path. That had been stupid of her. Taija had taught her better than that. Now the blasted man was smiling, typical women, but not to worry, you'll know your places soon enough. He had the same clipped accent that Taija had, if only she was here. Nynaeve scrambled to her feet, spinning webs as she went, razor-sharp air, a fireball, an overpowered shield to block his connection to Sedin. At the same time, Elaine used the distraction to open a gateway and send a shrieking, spinning blade of air through it behind the man. That wiped the smugness off his face, fortunately, as Nynaeve was frantically trying to fend off his monstrously overpowered webs. Taija never hit them with anything this strong. How powerful was this man? He dived to the floor at the last second to avoid Elaine's web, and it gave both women time to spin new gateways and relocate. Not a moment too soon, as both their previous positions disappeared in white-hot fire. "Stay still, you bitches, so I can put you in your places." Even while she was fighting for her life, Nynaeve wasn't sure what female dogs had to do with anything. A sweeping blade of air at foot level combined with what Taija called a blossom of fire, and Elaine was bombarding him with spikes of frozen air and water. Their webs didn't even seem to be bothering him. Instincts Taija had drilled into Nynaeve screamed, and she traveled across the chamber to see her previous location explode into rubble. Elaine was on the back foot, and she redoubled her own attack to take pressure off her. Another gateway, and then a stream of fireballs through it. Man whirled to face her, and suddenly she was under a relentless attack. Elaine tried to intervene and was swatted aside, staggering under an unseen blow. Nynaeve was fully on the defensive, channeling as much of Sedar as she could, pain stabbing at her temples, frantically slicing and deflecting webs she couldn't see. Thank the light for Taija's infuriating habit of inverting her webs. At least this wasn't completely outside her experience, although she still had no idea how the woman could do it so fast. Backwash of a fireball singed her face. Chips of rock from an explosion in the floor cut at her, and then suddenly the pressure ended. Nynaeve didn't try to work out why. She'd already opened a gateway across the chamber and stepped through it ready to attack once more. She sent a fireball at the man, even as she realized another woman had come into the chamber. She wore a simple, green, silk dress and had her iron-grey hair tied up in a bun with various ornaments dangling from it above an ageless face. More importantly, the light of Sedar surrounded her, very brightly in fact, far more than Nynaeve could hold. A veritable storm of webs lit up the air between them as the newcomer bombarded the man with Sedar. He seemed taken aback for a second and then spat, webs falling apart or splashing against unseen barriers around him. You're not even a looker, unlike the other two. He seemed to focus on the woman for a second and then staggered, surprise painted across his face. What the fuck? Nynaeve thought she recognized one of the expressions Taija often used when she was annoyed. Elaine refused to tell her what it meant, which was confirmation enough as far as she was concerned. She had already caught Elaine's eye, and they both opened gateways, splitting their flows to attack from their own positions and through the gateways, although Nynaeve could see the strain on Elaine's face from channeling so much of Sedar. The man was on the back foot now. Most of his focus seemed to be on the other woman, yet nothing seemed to be happening around her. All of her webs seemed to be directed purely into the offensive on him. He was staggering back, barely able to deflect or block the webs coming at him from 5 sides. He must have been incredibly strong based on the amount of Sedar the woman was channeling. Suddenly, the man snarled something Nynaeve only understood 1 or 2 words. Fuck this. Come at me without a paralyzed net, and you'll see how things end. A blinding light exploded outwards with a wall of sound, and by the time she'd reoriented herself, he'd gone, presumably fleeing. She took a step to run after him. They couldn't just let a dark friend like that, probably one of the Forsaken, go and then stopped herself. He'd been too strong for her and Elaine, and this new woman didn't look like one to run anywhere. Instead, she turned to face the woman, Elaine joining her. She knew they didn't look their best, even ignoring that they just leapt out of bed. They were both panting, singed and bloody in places from the fight. The woman, on the other hand, looked completely unruffled, everything about her immaculately placed. As Nynaeve looked her up and down, noting her ageless face, she gave them her own appraising look, seeing to weigh them up with a single hard-eyed glance. Ah, you must be the runaways. What? We are not. The woman simply rolled over Elaine's protest. Be silent, girl. There are more important things to deal with now. You may call me Cadsuane, said I. Now tell me, where is the dragon? We must go to his aid immediately. Nynaeve clenched her fists in her skirts. The woman spoke sense, but how dare she? For once Taija had been relieved to see Moiraine. Trying to fight alone in an enclosed space was a nightmare scenario for a channeler. A spear in the back would kill her just as dead as anyone else. In fact, her and Moiraine were working surprisingly well together. They hadn't spoken much, beyond agreeing that Taija would deal with threats further away, and she would be the inner line of channeling defense. They were both benefiting from their angrials, and the amount of Sedar that they could wield between the two of them was huge. With Lan smoothly dispatching anything that came too close, they were soon reaching the reception hall near Rand's apartments. A trail of dead shadow spawn and their victims behind them. Taija entered the hall to a scene of chaos. Defenders of the stone and ale fought in clusters surrounded by Trollocs. She didn't spot anyone she knew, except for Rand. He was fighting with his sword, laying about him with impressive speed and skill, but that wasn't all. He must have been channeling as shadow spawn near him seemed to suddenly lose their footing or catch fire. Taija was somewhat impressed. His control seemed to have really improved since he took Kalendor. For a second, it looked like he was about to be overwhelmed by a trio of Myrddraal. and then he opened a gateway that sliced straight through one of them and leapt through it to another part of the room. How in the light had he gone in a matter of weeks from just about doing it with a sangreal to making gateways in the middle of combat? There was no more time for thought, though. Taija and Muireann were unleashing the power on the hordes of Trollocs and Myrddraal, tearing through them like a knife through butter. She was able to relieve clusters of Ale and defenders who came together to fight the shadow spawn, but there always seemed to be more. There must have been a limit to them, though. Surely. Trying to fight with the power in close spaces like this really didn't play to Taija's strengths, or any channelers, really. Taija gestured to Muireann and Lan, and opened a gateway to what she thought was a bandstand on the far side of the hall. The three of them stepped through, and she got a better vantage point on the room. That meant she could hit more shadow spawn. Unfortunately, her more destructive webs risked killing people on her own side in this enclosed space, not least Rand himself. So Taija spun air and fire into explosive darts to be flung into whatever shadow spawn caught her attention. Splitting her flows as many ways as she could, Taija started to carve her way through the horde in a storm of fire and explosions. Beside her, Muireann seemed to have settled for flinging overpowered fireballs into larger concentrations of the beasts, while Lan rapidly killed any that tried to climb up to them. On the other side of the hall, Taija saw Rand step out of a gateway into a cluster of defenders, which included a tall, dark-haired man slicing his way through the Trollocs with an impressive display of swordsmanship. She thought it was his new swordmaster. Although she'd avoided speaking to the man, swords reminded her too much of Tell. To give Rand some help and relieve the pressure on the group he was in, Taija diverted some of the multitude of flows she was channeling into a razor-sharp blade of air slicing through the air at neck level on the Trollocs pressing them. A number fell, decapitated on the spot, but she realized she'd missed a couple of Myrddraal, passing the blade over their heads. Sloppy. A moment later, Muireann incinerated them. The shadow spawn in the hall were dying faster than they could receive reinforcements, but Taija had no doubt the stone was teeming with the creatures. She might need to find the girls and fight her way out if it was as bad as it looked. The wards she'd set up would stop gateways that crossed their threshold, turning the place into a trap for any channeler in it. Taija saw the swordmaster scream something at Rand. He froze for a second. She nearly shouted her own warning as a Myrddraal lashed out for the opening Rand left, but lightning fast, the swordmaster parried its blade and beat it back. A moment later, Rand opened a gateway and vanished through it. She had no idea where to. It wasn't long after that she and the others killed the last of the Trollocs and Myrddraal in the hall, but Taija could still faintly hear the sounds of screams and roars echoing down the corridors. The stone must be teeming with the monsters. Wearily she steeled herself to go hunting when suddenly lightning seemed to crawl into the hall from the direction of Rand's quarters. Taija couldn't feel anything from it, so it was probably Sedin. It looked almost alive as it crabbed over the ceiling like it was questing, hunting for something. Its prey was revealed when a squad of Trollocs charged into the hall. Before Taija could hit them with her own web, the lightning lashed out from the ceiling, spearing them from above, killing them instantly before continuing its probing spread. Everyone was staring at the lightning open-mouthed, many of them with fear in their eyes. Taija realized her own mouth had dropped open too, and she quickly closed it. She could recognize what it was, a construct aimed at shadow spawn, but how the fuck was Rand doing it, if it was even him? The inefficiencies and power requirements alone. The lightning was showing no signs of abating, and Taija could only assume it was spreading through the whole stone. One person, even with a sangreal, shouldn't have been able to do that. How powerful was he? How powerful was Callandor? Taija was about to go looking for him when he staggered into the room, Callandor in his arms, almost too bright to look at. His face was locked in a grim rictus, and he was surrounded by storm clouds pumping out more of the lightning. Taija breathed a sigh of relief as the cloud started to dissipate, and Rand's face relaxed. Then he looked around the hall, taking in the piles of bodies, people and shadow spawn alike, and rage suffused his face. She heard him shout something, and Callandor grew even brighter in his grip. A new construct seemed to be forming around him. Taija thought he'd already killed every shadow spawn in the stone, possibly every single one in Tyr. Light only know what he was thinking. She could feel her hair literally standing on end, the very air in the room charging. It was madness. She wasn't going to let an untrained channeler with a sangreal kill her and everyone else around him. Taija spun a gateway and stepped through it beside him, dimly registering Moiraine had done the same. "Rand, stop this madness," Moiraine screamed, and he whirled towards her, anger in his eyes. Taija's instincts were telling her to get as far away from him as possible, but she made herself grab his arm, the muscles wound up tight as steel under his shirt. "Rand, please. Think for a second, stop." Maybe her words got through to him, or perhaps it was the way Moiraine stepped backwards, her composure briefly replaced by terror. But the tension left Rand's body, and the light from Calendor subsided. A second later it was just a crystal sword again, and Rand staggered with sudden exhaustion. Taija let out a deep sigh of relief and put a comforting hand on his shoulder, feeling his shoulders rise and fall with each gasping breath under it. "It's okay, Rand, breathe," she muttered. That had been deeply disturbing. She was going to need to put some thought into it when everyone had calmed down. Slowly the soldiers started to clap and cheer for the Lord Dragon, as they realized they were still alive, and the Trollocs had been defeated, probably not realizing how close they had just come to Rand losing control and obliterating the stone and them with it. It was because of their hollering that Taija didn't hear anyone coming up behind her until Elaine's cry of "Taija." Rand seemed to be recovering his breath, and had straightened up, so Taija turned to face her with a smile. She just looked silly trying to keep her hand on Rand's shoulder when he stood up straight anyway. Elaine looked pleased to see Taija, but something was bothering her. Nynaeve looked tense as a cold spring, and there was a woman she didn't recognize with them. A woman with an ageless face, hard eyes and hair tied up in a grey bun adorned with jewellery that looked surprisingly fashionable for something from this time. Inevitably, Taija's attention was focused on her as she strode through the room, making a beeline for her, or more likely for Rand. She barely spared a glance for the bodies on the floor or the surviving soldiers and dedicated. Yet her dark eyes seemed to take everything in. Taija could feel her strength in the power, impressive for this time and well beyond Moiraine's, but not on her level. She looked decidedly unimpressed when she stopped in front of Taija, the girls trailing behind her. She tutted loudly, "Well, this is quite the mess. You must be Randall Thor. Well, look me in the eyes when you speak to me, boy. Did you mother not teach you manners?" Before the speechless Rand could gather himself, she'd moved on. "Moiraine." The woman received a nod in return that was so frosty Taija was surprised the room's temperature didn't drop, and then the woman's eyes are on her. "And you must be Taija." Her tone said it all. Taija had more than had enough by that point, and she was absolutely not going to be sneered at by a modern Aes Sedai. "That's Taija Sedai to you." Her voice was sharp. The woman dismissed her with a glance and turned back to Rand. "My name is Cadsuane Meladrin." Taija could already tell she was going to be a problem. Chapter 54, Interlude Roman 15. Wait, is that a landmine? Nah, everything's fine. Chapter text Interlude Roman 15. Wait, is that a landmine? Nah, everything's fine. Cadsuane tutted to herself as she steadily moved the knitting needles, listening to the conversation going on around her. The rediscovery of traveling really was fortuitous. If not for that, she would probably still be trundling around the West chasing rumors of a false dragon, rather than sitting here an advisor, although perhaps not yet a trusted one, to the dragon reborn. He'd been thinking about returning to her farm after the rather disappointing experience that had been helping with the capture of Mazrim Tame. Then she had heard rumors about a new false dragon, this Randall Thor who was making a name for himself in Tarman Head. That had sounded far more interesting than going back to tending plants in the obscurity of retirement, so off she had gone. It had not been long after that news of the split in the tower had also come to her. And what madness that had been. She certainly had better things to do than to get involved in such foolishness. Next, they would be asking her to become Amielin as a compromise or some such rubbish. No, she had decided it was much better to see about dealing with Ulthor. Still, she had made a diversion to Siwan Sanch's exiled tower, as it had not been so far out of her way. She was still, arguably, the Amielin seat after all. It was disappointing, really. There could not have been much more than 100 maybe sisters there. She had expected better of the woman. Siwan herself had been irritatingly tight-lipped. She simply would not share any more than the most basic of information with Cadsuane. The woman was hard too, so she could not simply be pushed into giving way to Cadsuane in the manner some of her predecessors had. More was the pity. Still, what had Aleda been thinking? Cadsuane doubted the woman was a dark friend like Siwon claimed, more likely just an idiot. However, that was bad enough. Once Ulthor had been dealt with, perhaps she should do something about the woman, as long as they did not try to make her Amulin in her place. What had truly astounded her, though, was that Siwon had been sitting on the greatest discovery of the last 1,000 years. She had refused to speak about it. It was clear that Siwon did not trust her, and she supposed the woman had no reason to, but it was most inconvenient. Regardless, it had been easy enough to extract the secret of traveling from one of the other sisters there. Once she had that, there had been no particular need to stay around Siwon's tower in exile. So it had been on to Falme, suddenly a journey of weeks turning into seconds. Falme had been an education. The people there were convinced that Ulthor was the dragon reborn. Of course, that was a story she had seen too many times before with false dragons. If they were unable to take people in then, they would hardly see any success. The wreckage of the center of the town was interesting, though. The boy was clearly a strong channeler, and these Sinchen would bear some thought if even half the stories about them were true. It had been easy enough to find out that young Ulthor had made his way on to Ter. Apparently Moiraine Damadrid was accompanying him, which had been perplexing. Cadsuane had wondered what kind of game could she have been playing. It had certainly explained the stories of an Aes Sedai fighting the Sinchen, but it had been difficult to think that she could actually believe he was the dragon. When she had arrived in Tyr, Cadsuane had discreetly established herself in the city's finest inn, right in the shadow of the stone, ready to commence her investigations in the morning. She had thought the main priority would be stopping the boy before he turned the city to chaos. The next morning, it had not taken long for her to receive one of the greatest shocks of her life. Before she could do much more than look at the stone, she had seen the dragon's banner flying above it. It had been hard to believe, but she was nothing if not grounded in reality, and that banner had said it all. Perhaps Ulthor boy really was the dragon reborn. She had ended up making a rare retreat back to her inn for a complete rethink. Once she had straightened herself out, Cadsuane had had a number of plans for how she would introduce herself to Ulthor. He had fulfilled the prophecies, or at least enough of them that it was clear he was no false dragon. He would need guidance, though, and she would need to be there to provide that. This was far more important than hunting down false dragons or even putting that fool woman Aleda in her place. It would likely be the most important work of her life, in fact. However, those plans had fallen apart when that very night she heard the sound of fighting and screams on the wind, coming from the stone. The citizenry of Tyr had been out on the streets around the stone, staring at it and muttering to each other about what was going on. She had heard more than one person confidently saying that the dragon must have gone mad and was going to kill them all. Regardless of the cause, it had been clear that the time for waiting was over, and she needed to be inside the stone. She had quickly found herself fighting her way through hordes of shadow spawn, with no idea how they had reached the place. Of course, the vile creatures had fallen before her, but they should not have been anywhere near this far south. However, that had not been the real surprise of the evening. That had come when she found the two young runaways, and more importantly, their opponent. A man, channeling. As far as she had been able to tell, he had been even stronger than Largain or Tame. It had felt mad to think it, but faced with his strange clothing, his strength and his shouting in the old tongue, she had seriously considered that she might be facing one of the Forsaken. Even now, thinking about that made her want to shudder, not that she allowed herself to. The two runaway girls fighting him had been impressive. When she had finished with their punishments, she would have to have them show her some of their tactics. It would not do to encourage them to get above themselves before they were properly reminded of their position, though. Truly a pity that they had been allowed to leave the tower at all, let alone continue to run free. It all seemed to come back to Moiraine's laxity and this Taija woman. Of course the girls had been losing. How could they have hoped to take on one of the Forsaken? They had been lucky that she had arrived when she did and had been able to drive the man off. She thanked the light, not for the first time, that she had her Angreal and Turangreal collection. That would have been a far harder fight otherwise. One she was less sure the three of them would have won or even survived. The girl's reaction to her had been disturbing too. No curtsy, none of the respect that a novice and an accepted should show to an Aes Sedai. Clearly, they needed to be taken in hand. Then there was the boy she had come for. Randall Thor had not quite been what she had expected. He was clearly an incredibly powerful channeler, though. His display with the weave to kill the shadow spawn was enough to tell her that. As usual, she tried to put him off balance as soon as she spoke to him. She had obviously succeeded at that, but he had quickly bounced back. It seemed the boy was strong, nervous about his position as one might expect, but willing and able to push back. Good, he would need to be. Not arrogant, though, that was unexpected. Of course, she had changed tactics as soon as this became clear. She would never give way to people or be shy and retiring, but she was perfectly capable of calibrating her behavior. The boy needed a strong supporter, someone he would listen to and rely on to speak the truth without fear, but who would also boost his confidence and position. The ability to adapt was something so many of her sisters sadly lacked. It certainly explained the current parlous state of the tower. That brought her to the meeting she was sitting in a few weeks later, part of what seemed to have become Rand's inner circle of advisors. There was Moiraine, obviously. The woman had not made such a mess of things that she was excluded from that. Her warder Lan, too, although he rarely had anything to say. There was also Ruach, the Ale clan chief. Now there was an interesting man, but his presence made sense. The runaway novice, Elaine, was also there, perhaps for her royal blood. She did not seem to be in a relationship with young Thor, which would be the obvious explanation. Then there were the two conundrums, Alexei and Taija Sedai. She snorted internally at the title and glanced over at the small woman who seemed to be staring into space yet again. Alexei had been difficult at first. As far as she could tell, he was an Andorran peasant. His accent, the way he held himself, his views. They all but shouted country boy made good. Not so far off Thor, in fact. She had assumed he was just an old friend of the boy, like the slippery young Matt, and was in the council because of that. However, that changed when she got close enough for one of her Turangreal to solve the mystery of his position. He could channel, too. Something would have to be done about that at some point, but not now, not when things were still delicate with Thor. It also explained the bigger mystery in the group. Taija Kosola Mernon. The woman had placed an odd emphasis on the full name when they were properly introduced. Everyone treated her as an Aes Sedai, despite all the evidence to the contrary. Ignoring the fact that Cadsuane had never heard of her, the woman did not have the face for it. She wore no great serpent ring, and most damning of all, she could not even channel. Cadsuane had spent centuries being able to assess the strength of a woman at a glance, and Taija gave her nothing. Of course, that did not fit with what people had said about her. Moiraine had been characteristically tight-lipped, as unforthcoming as ever. All the woman had said was, "I leave her be for a very good reason. You can take my advice to do the same, or on your own head be the consequences." Ultimately, it had just made Cadsuane all the more determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. However, others were more than willing to talk about Taija and her various achievements. If they were to be believed, she was a channeler of prodigious strength and talent, an inspirational Aes Sedai many had assured her. It was ridiculous. Cadsuane was not stupid enough to underestimate a powerful wielder. Her experiences after attaining the shawl had put paid to that. However, a woman who could not even channel was hardly a concern on the same level. It was not even just a question of ability to channel. She had met plenty of strong women over the years, and Taija was simply not one of them. She avoided conflict, allowed herself to be snubbed, and half the time did not even pay attention to what was going on around her. She was like the worst of the Brown sisters, except that it was obvious she had only a fraction of their knowledge. Cadsuane could not place the woman's odd accent, but her vocabulary was entirely Andorran peasant. Even Alexei seemed more well-spoken than she was. As for her education, why, a few days before she had actually asked what the sea folk were and looked surprised at the answer. Perhaps it was the way she would occasionally use appallingly accented phrases in the old tongue that helped fool people. They would often mistake a surface level of knowledge as a sign of sophistication. Whatever the case, everyone continued to refer to her as Taija Sedai. Even Moiraine, who should have been furious at the insult to the White Tower. It was of no matter. He had been careful in case the true reason was some unforeseen danger. However, When she had finally realized that Alexei could channel, it had all become clear. The dragon reborn might be permitted to walk free as a male channeler, but the same could not be said for any other man. A friend of his who could channel would need help covering it up. That was where Taija came in. What better cover for a hidden channeler than to have a public one there to take credit for his deeds? Of course, Moiraine must be aware. Further evidence of her failings, really. Although, if Cadsuane was going to be fair, it was probably a sensible decision not to confront Ulthor about his friend when the man could potentially be unstable. The runaways would go along with it because, instead of the harsh lessons and discipline of the White Tower, they would be allowed to play around doing whatever they wanted while pretending to be taught by someone barely older than them. They clearly already thought of themselves as above the Tower's tutelage. She was not sure what Taija got out of covering for a male channeler. Perhaps it was simply the prestige of being acknowledged as an Aes Sedai and being able to go around doing whatever she wanted, wearing whatever she felt like too. She tutted at the thought of Taija's deeply inappropriate dress sense. Still, that would not be enough by itself. There must be some relationship with Alexei too. They spent far too much time together for anything else. They could not be related, despite their Andoran syntax. She looked nothing like him, more like a Tarabona. Perhaps lovers, then. That made sense. A desperate woman protecting her lover the only way she could. It was certainly a more sympathetic story than a power-hungry girl taking advantage of the forbearance of the Aes Sedai. Regardless, it would have to be nipped in the bud. Ulthor could be allowed his friend. She was not foolish enough to try to interfere with that. For now, anyway. However, she could not tolerate Taija taking the Tower's name in vain, especially not when she was doing such a bad job of it. Every day she continued with her pretense, she damaged the reputation of Aes Sedai that little bit more. Ulthor finished speaking. Does anyone have anything they wish to add? He looked around the room, and everyone shook their heads except Taija, who was slumped slightly in her chair, biting her bottom lip and staring into space. An unedifying display from the girl. She could not resist speaking up. I am not sure Taija heard you, Rand. Perhaps the girl should pay more attention if she's going to attend these meetings. Everyone winced at her comment, and she could have sworn those next to her leant away slightly. Yes, she must be Alexei's lover if people were that worried about his reaction. After a moment of everyone staring at her, Taija seemed to jolt in her seat and look up, blinking owlishly for a second before mumbling, "Oh, no, nothing from me, sorry." A moment later, she was back in whatever fantasy world she was inhabiting. Something would have to be done about this. If nothing else, the runaways could not be left to stagnate under Taija's charge. They needed disciplining for running away from the tower and then to be properly trained so that their talent did not go to waste. She had little time for it herself, but she supposed she would have to make some. As for Taija, Cadsuane needed to maintain her relationship with Ulthor and hence Alexei, but they would also have to understand that this was tower business. She would treat the girl gently, at least compared to what she deserved. There was no need to alienate them further than necessary, but this farce could not be allowed to continue. Chapter 55. The Weight of the World. Chapter text, chapter Roman 38. The weight of the world. It was kind of impressive how fast Cadsuane took up a position in Rand's inner circle. She was practically a force of nature. After her rude entrance, she seemed to turn on the spot, while everyone was still off balance, suddenly respectful, albeit aloof, and more importantly offering good advice to Rand. The adeptness with which she seemed to be able to switch between behaviors was a bit frightening. As far as Taija could see, Cadsuane was everything that this time's Aes Sedai tried to be. Mysterious, domineering, and manipulative. She hated it. Still, she was without a doubt competent. Regardless of Cadsuane, Taija was finding herself increasingly distracted by what she had felt linked with Rand. Every day it bothered her more. The fact that she just ignored the taint as an issue too. Yet another fuck-up. Taija even felt a bit guilty about her conversation with Moiraine. In hindsight, she'd been coming to her with what she clearly thought was a major problem, and Taija had reacted by threatening to kill her rather than listening to someone who, if she was honest with herself, would know much better than her. This really wasn't the person Taija was, or at least the person she wanted to be. There was only one thing she could do. She needed to fix things. At first, Taija made it her mission to learn more about the taint and men channeling. The stone had an adequate library, and while there seemed to be scant material on male channelers, there was still some which she devoured. It was mostly unscientific garbage, but even that just made her feel worse. How stupid could she have been to ignore it? She didn't want to believe it, though. Maybe that was why she hadn't believed the taint was real. Only seeing what she wanted to see. Stupid. She needed to deal with reality as it was, not as she wanted it to be. Homicidal madness in anything from weeks to a few years with a gradual descent, and even if they managed to keep their sanity, they inevitably died as their body rotted away. Story after story of men killing their families, their loved ones, whoever happened to be around them. Villages burnt, armies razed and destroyed, severed, hanged, burnt to death by mobs. It was horrific, disgusting, tragic. Another scar across her memories of her own time, apparently inevitable for both Rand and Alexei. Played over and over again in Taija's mind. Worse, every male channeler she ever knew. The lucky ones dead in the war. And Tiro must have died when the town hall collapsed, thank the light. The unlucky ones mad, killing, burning, finishing what the shadow started. Taija wanted to vomit, curl into a ball and cry, but that wasn't an option. 3,000 years, and no one had done anything to solve the problem. They gave up thousands of years ago, accepting the state of their world. There was no one else. She didn't think she could do the impossible, but if not her, then who? Taija had started thinking on the problem the day after Rand came to her and asked some oddly specific questions. She hadn't stopped since. Why hadn't the Aes Sedai fixed the problem of the taint when it first came about? With the full resources of her society behind them and the war ending, surely they could have done it. Had things really fallen apart to such a degree that they couldn't by the end of the war? The research institutes, talented scientists, Sangreal. What had gone wrong? Taija had to assume that things had fallen too far, which was a tragedy in itself. If the world she knew hadn't been able to save itself, then there was no chance she could alone. So it must have already been shattered. It was the only way she could keep on hoping. Taija hated the thought of the glorious beauty that was her world in ruins, but it had to have been. It had to. Despite her horror at the situation, there was something about the taint that grabbed her attention. It wasn't yet another obnoxious Aes Sedai, simpering noble or badly behaved teenager. To be fair, the teenagers weren't that bad, they were just young. It was the sort of thing that she devoted her life to. Over 150 years spent analyzing the foundations of the universe. Esoteric particles, wave functions, the power. It was her bread and butter. Taija was good at fighting, there was no question about it, but it wasn't her. Science was her first and last love, and unlike every other love she'd had, she hadn't lost it. She didn't get her third name before 200 for no reason. This meant every spare moment was spent thinking about the taint, remembering how it felt, the way it moved with Sedin, and trying to think about how to stop it. She'd even found a new favorite spot for thinking. An old tower on top of the stone that was difficult to reach without traveling. There she could sit and channel in peace, think about the taint, without being bothered by all the people who wanted her time. Meals were brief. She made sure to wash regularly, and she made time for the girls. Other than that, every minute away from the problem was a wasted one. While trying to work out what was going on with the taint was taking up almost all of Taija's attention. She made sure that she kept on working on the girls' training. It was sad that Egwene wasn't there too, though. She hoped that she was doing well with the wise ones. One of the first things Taija did was a proper debrief on the attack on the stone. They fought Ravin, which was a shock, but no one else she could think of would be both a male channeler in this time and dress like such a prick. Taija was amazed at the fact that the girls held him off for as long as they did. Cadsuane was also clearly a very competent channeler. Taija could feel her strength, and she wasn't in Ravin's league. She was a fair bit weaker than Taija, in fact, so she must have an Angreal. She took a few sessions to go over the girls' fight with Ravin blow by blow, going into what they did right and what they could have done better. Overall, she was really quite impressed, but there were a few things that she added to her teaching plans for them. Taija spent as much time as she felt she could spare, more really, teaching them, and it was pretty rewarding, actually. The girls learnt like sponges, soaking everything up faster than she could hope for. Tactics, channeling, history, and philosophy, Taija covered them all. If she was going to be teaching them, then she was going to turn them into proper Aes Sedai. Taija did wish she had more of a talent for healing, though. Nynaeve seemed to have independently discovered or rediscovered how to do true healing. If she hadn't seen it, Taija would have thought it was impossible at her level of training. She really needed someone who could help her develop and nurture her talent. Unfortunately, she was stuck with Taija doing her inadequate best. In lieu of that, one of the things Taija had them working on was inverting webs. While Siwyn didn't have the patience to practice enough, or possibly the talent for it, she was fairly sure that she could get them up to the level where they would be fast enough to use the technique in combat, at least at a basic level. Sometimes Alexei sat in too, particularly when Taija was talking about non-power-related matters or discussing combat tactics. He was even more interested than the girls in a lot of what she had to say, or at least he did a good job of pretending. It was after one of those sessions that Alexei followed Taija out. That wasn't unusual, but what was how worried he looked. "Taija, can we talk? In private?" He looked around nervously. Of course, she didn't hesitate to swing into a side room and spin a ward against eavesdropping. "What's wrong? Tell me." He took a moment to gather his thoughts. "It's about Sedin." He began hesitantly. "Rand has a teacher. He took me aside and said he wanted me to have lessons too, that he could help me far more than Rand could." Taija was a little confused. "Well, that's good news, isn't it? Why didn't Rand tell her, though?" "Yes. Well, no, I don't know." He hesitated a moment, and then it spilt out in a flurry of words. "It's Rand's new swordmaster. He's not who he says he is. Rand made me swear not to tell you before he'd let me learn from him. I think he was a false dragon before, at least that's what Rand implied." Why would Rand be worried about that? Taija was a bit confused. Was it because he was a former rival? "Ha!" Alexei barked a laugh. "Sometimes I forget how much you don't know. False dragons are not good people. They've brought destruction, war, and ultimately madness to the world. Every sane hand is turned against them. He probably thought you'd hunt the man down and gentle him yourself." Oh. She felt a little uncomfortable at the idea. "Wait, though, you swore to Rand that you wouldn't tell me." Alexei shrugged and looked embarrassed. "I'm your warder. Of course I was going to tell you. You know where my loyalties lie." That made her smile. "Thank you, Alexei." He still looked a bit nervous, though. "You're not going to hunt him down and gentle him, are you?" His voice dropped to a whisper. "I think he might be Mazrim tame. He's definitely from the borderlands." Taija spoke slowly, carefully, remembering the words of the Aelfin. "Well, whatever his past, don't they say that the dragon breaks all ties? Perhaps he can redeem himself by helping you and Rand." She wouldn't say it to anyone from this time, but she had more than a little sympathy for men who declared themselves the dragon reborn. It might well look like a better option than just rolling over and dying or being severed. "Look, learn what you can from him and be careful. I don't want to interfere when you and Rand both need a teacher to survive. Let him keep his secrets. I trust you. Keep an eye on him, and if he does anything to hurt you or Rand, then tell me straight away. Otherwise, I think I don't want to know. Let him have his privacy, and we can all forget he was ever a false dragon." Taija still went to Rand's inner council meetings, despite resenting the time away from thinking on the problem of the taint. An element of that was stubbornness. She knew Moiraine and Cadsuane would love to see her pushed out, and she wasn't so distracted that she'd allow that. But also he was her friend, and he might need her support if they were pushing too hard for their own agendas. That didn't mean she paid much attention in them, though. Taija was ready to intervene if things got heated, but normally they were just talking about politics, ruling tier, other no doubt important, but still boring things that she just didn't feel she knew much about. She'd asked a question about the Seafolk a few days ago, which had apparently been deeply stupid. Taija had had to fight hard not to blush under the witheringly unimpressed look she'd received from Cadsuane. Not knowing basic things about the world was infuriating, as was people thinking she was an idiot. It wasn't like they even had what would have been considered a basic education in her time. Cadsuane probably thought it rained because the creator was crying or something like that. However, Taija had more important, and if she was totally honest with herself, more interesting and exciting things to do than to worry about that. It wasn't like it was in the good old days, but she was finally faced with the kind of problem that she dedicated her life to figuring out. If only it hadn't been so utterly horrifying. That was why in many meetings while they droned on, she was just thinking about the taint. Taija knew she should pay more attention, but she just couldn't get her mind off it. So she sat there, carefully spinning tiny, incredibly intricate, inverted webs, quietly watching and manipulating them as she tried to figure out what could impact on the taint. Her starting point had been a series of webs designed by a Lemhak Tissera Debir for separating outflows of the power to allow analysis at the smallest possible level. She'd improved on them back in the day, and she thought they might be the best starting point here. Before she could solve a problem like the taint, she needed to be able to measure it, to interact with it. Once she had that, she'd be able to manipulate it, and then it would just be a matter of time to a solution. Hopefully, anyway. Spirit in ultra-fine, layered sheets, threaded through with an interconnecting lattice of fire, air, earth, and water. It was unlikely anyone else would be able to replicate something like this now, based on the lack of subtlety of the channelers of this time anyway, but that was fine. Concept first, then replicability. Taija narrowed her eyes. If she upped the amount of fire on the transverse flows and also interwove more spirit into the lattice, might that work better? Suddenly she realized with a jump that the room had gone silent. When she refocused, everyone was staring at her. Had she missed something? Why did they look worried? Except Cadswain, she looked predatory. Oh, Taija rewound vague memories. She thought they asked if she had anything to add. Oh, no, nothing from me, sorry. She mumbled the words. They were talking about some plot or another from a high lord. Boring. Her mind was already going back to that little inverted web. The glowing, multicolored lattice sat simultaneously suspended in the air in front of her, invisible to everyone else, and modeled in her mind at the same time. Perhaps this one would work, but she was sure she could improve it further. Taija was vaguely aware that she was biting her bottom lip, a bad habit when she was concentrating too hard, but she had much too much to think about to worry about that. Weeks went by in a blur as Taija focused her attention on the taint. Rand was already getting too busy for her to experiment on him. He was more than willing to accommodate her when he had time, but she knew he had 1,001 things pressing down on him. He seemed to be somewhere between King of Tyr and the Messiah, and he had better things to do than stand there feeling the filth of the taint flow through him while she tried to feel it out. Luckily, Alexei seemed to be learning prodigiously quickly. He must have had a fair bit of talent, although Taija suspected he was also pushing himself more than was safe. She'd say something, but she knew he'd just ignore it, and with the situation they were all in, getting strong, fast, was probably a sensible risk to take. It wasn't long before he'd learnt enough to be able to seize Sedin on command, and therefore also to enter a link with Taija and one of the girls. She felt just as bad making him stand there channeling the taint as she did with Rand, but she needed to feel it, explore it, even though it turned her stomach. Every moment she wasn't working on it, she was having to avoid imagining some of the very few living people she could consider herself close to dying horribly. Taija drew on Sedin through Alexei, the trickle of power that he could handle suffused with the oily horror of the taint. She was hopeful she was onto something this time. Channeling Sedar, she spun the web she'd been working on for the last week, placing the finely spun, intricate web of all 5 elements over the flow of the male half. It sunk into the bands of Sedin, and her face fell. Sedin moved through it freely, as planned, but there was no interaction with the taint, just nothing. She wanted to cry. What was she missing? Taija could feel the taint. She could fucking see the taint in the flows, yet she couldn't find a web of Sedar that would interact with it in any way. What was wrong with her? She sat down with a thump, releasing both the link and Sedar head in her hands. She needed to think. There had to be a solution. There had to be. She couldn't be useless for this too. Research was meant to be collaborative. It was resource-intensive. Scientists didn't just sit there thinking clever thoughts until everything came together. She should be in a proper lab. Spotless white walls, surrounded by towering custom-made detection and analysis turangreal, not smooth stone and medieval tapestries. Taija wished she had her team with her too. Together, they were the best in the world as far as she was concerned. She couldn't have done half the things she had without them. There had been Lewin, her number 2. He'd been the rock the team rested on, dead during the war. Ilaria had been so young and bright. Belen had killed her. She hadn't even finished her doctorate. Taija could remember the sight of her intestines across the office floor like it was yesterday. Shinju, dead too. Sarita, the same day, dead. Mokta, dead. Bala, dead. Dead, 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 dead. The word repeated itself in her head. They were all dead. It was all down to her to solve this. Just her. Alone. She shuddered and blinked rapidly to clear the blurring in her eyes. After a moment, Taija felt a large hand on your shoulder. When did you last sleep, Taija? Alexi's voice was full of concern. Last night, she immediately protested, but actually, I'm not sure. He nodded firmly. You're going to bed now, and you're going to sleep until tomorrow morning, even if I have to get Nynaeve to feed you some of her herbs. No, I need to. Alexi cut off her protest. No arguing. Bed now, or I'll carry you there. Taija found she didn't have the energy to argue. Come on, Taija. He easily hauled her to her feet and tugged her along, an arm round her shoulders. She staggered a little. Maybe sleep wasn't such a bad idea. Okay, I'm going, she muttered petulantly. He just kept walking her along. I know you're trying to save me, and I can't tell you how thankful I am, but I'm not going to watch you kill yourself doing it. MMRMPH. Taija mumbled something incoherent. She was vaguely aware that people were giving her odd looks as they went by. She supposed it was a break of these people's decorum that he got his arm round her, let alone that he was taking her to bed. Idiots. She was practically asleep by the time her head hit the pillow. A few days later, Taija was walking through the corridors of the stone when Ruach suddenly appeared beside her. His disconcerting ability to sneak up on her aside. It was odd. He'd seemed to be avoiding her ever since their last conversation, although she hadn't been sure why. Had more important things to think about anyway. At least he slowed his pace to a more reasonable one for her. I see you, Taija, said I. When Taija looked up at him, he didn't seem desperately keen to be there. Hello, Ruach. What's up? I mean, how are you? She should probably try to greet him the same way he greeted her. Another little thing to file away for when she had the headspace. I am well, Taija, said I. I think that soon we shall be returning to the dedicated waste. Now that was interesting. Oh, really? Why is that? I thought that Rand was the man you were looking for, your chief of chiefs. Discomfort flashed across his stony face. Why did so many people in this time seem to put so much work on not showing their facial expressions? Whether Rand al'Thor is the chief of chiefs remains to be seen. It is for the wise ones and Ruidian to determine the truth of the matter. But you think he is? Ruach's shrug didn't deny it, but neither did it confirm it. What will be, will be. He glanced around, almost looking like he was nervous, but didn't say anything. Well, I suppose I'll go with him, so it'll be nice to see Egwene again. The idea made Taija feel a bit more cheerful. She'd missed having her around. Ruach nodded. Yes, she is headstrong, but learning fast. Taija raised her eyebrows. How do you know that? The wise one Amy's is a dreamer, so she passes on messages to me sometimes. Oh, of course, that made sense. Quite convenient for them, too, to be able to communicate fairly quickly without traveling. That seemed to kill the conversation, though, and they walked in a slightly uncomfortable silence. Still, he didn't seem to want to leave. Was he trying to hit on her? Surely not. She was just imagining it. She must have been. He was being really awkward, though. Then again, awkwardness seemed to be standard for the dedicated when they spoke to her. Not that she'd be interested anyway. The very idea of getting with someone at the moment just made Taija want to curl into a ball and eat ice cream all night. Another thing lacking from this time. She couldn't be with someone that tall anyway. It gave her phantom neck ache just thinking about it. She was definitely just imagining it, for fuck's sake. After a minute, Taija threw him a bone. It was uncomfortable seeing the normally so impassive man looking awkward. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about? She was surprised to see him look around again. He really was uncomfortable about something. I had hoped to speak more of the dedicated to peace. He looked like he'd rather be talking about anything else. You do? That was not what she'd expected. Ruach nodded firmly. You said that you went out into the fields to hear them sing. This was definitely one of the stranger ways that Taija had had someone hit on her, if that was even what he was doing. She wasn't sure enough to turn him down. That would be awkward if he was really just curious. Oh, well, I just went once. It was basically just fields. Not very interesting, really, too flat. They were doing a growing song. It was interesting, I suppose, nice voices. Jin was much more interesting. That's the city I stayed in for the visit. You should have seen their history museum. They had artifacts from the First Age, and it was much more interesting than songs. She realized she was babbling, and Ruach seemed to be unsure how to react. Wait a minute, wasn't he married? She was sure he'd mentioned that before. Would that stop him? She needed to get out of there before she made an idiot of herself by telling him she wasn't interested or something. Oh, I've just remembered I'm meant to be speaking to Alexei about something. I have to run, sorry. Taija was already moving off at speed. Chapter 56. Click, boom. Chapter text, chapter Roman 39, click. Boom. Rand was sitting through yet another meeting, this time with Ruark and Lan, to discuss the disposition of the defenders of the stone and the ale. However, his mind was elsewhere. At first he hadn't been sure about Cadsuane, but he had to admit that she'd grown on him. Not only was her usefulness undeniable, but after that strange, initial rudeness, she'd also become far more polite and helpful, slotting herself neatly in among his advisors. She could still be abrasive, but she gave good advice and seemed to be much less focused on trying to manipulate him than Moiraine. She also had a talent for ferreting out secrets and a thorough understanding of a huge range of subjects. Of course, Rand wasn't stupid. He was well aware that she was Aes Sedai, a modern one anyway, and that he needed to look at everything she said and did 3 times to weed out hidden agendas. However, useful was useful, and he certainly needed skilled advisors. The only real fly in the ointment seemed to be Taija. He mentally corrected himself. The problem was Cadsuane's feelings about Taija, not Taija herself. Cadsuane seemed to have a grudge against her, and he simply could not work out why. He'd asked her more than once, and each time she'd said that the affairs of the Aes Sedai were for them alone and not to be questioned by outsiders. That seemed to be her response to anything to do with Taija. He could see that something was eating Taija up from the inside too, which wasn't helping. He'd asked her what he could do to help, and she just said not to worry about it and that he had enough on his plate. But he could see how distracted she was from, well, everything. The worry painted across her face when she thought no one was looking. He wasn't even sure she was noticing Cadsuane's petty sniping. In a way, he hoped she wasn't. His conversation with Cadsuane just before this meeting had been particularly odd. He'd asked, well, no, he'd ordered her to stop her sniping at Taija, and didn't it feel strange to be giving orders to Aes Sedai? She just smiled and told him not to worry. She knew Alexei could channel. While he'd been spluttering protests, she told him that he had nothing to worry about with the man. She accepted the situation there and wouldn't interfere. But since Alexei was safe, she would be resolving the situation with Taija so that there would be no need for any further conflict. Hadn't been sure what she'd meant by that, and then she'd left with a reminder that while she supported him as the Dragon Reborn, the affairs of Aes Sedai were for them alone, but that he shouldn't worry she would bring her conflict with Taija to an end as requested. It had been bothering him ever since. Surely it was good that she was going to resolve things, except that what you heard an Aes Sedai say wasn't always what they meant. Resolve could mean all kinds of things, bring an end to mother's milk in a cup. He sprang to his feet, already moving to the door. Sorry, I have to go. Light take him, if he was right, and with Taija in her current mental state, there'd be blood on the floor, probably Cadsuane's. He broke into a dead run towards the room he knew Taija liked to use for her lessons. If he was right, Cadsuane was about to do something very stupid. About a week after her very odd conversation with Ruark, Taija was sitting in the room that she'd commandeered for lessons with the girls. Teaching the 2 girls was essentially the only break that she got from her efforts at solving the problem of the taint on Sedin. It was a pity Egwene wasn't there too, but she never ceased to be amazed by the speed at which Elaine and Nynaeve picked things up. They even put up with her various lectures on philosophy and being Aes Sedai with decent grace. Today, as he often did, Alexei was sitting in too, as she wasn't really focusing on Sedar. In fact, they'd somehow managed to get her diverted into an explanation of movies and how they worked. Taija knew exactly what they were doing when they tried to distract her away from her planned topic and onto something more exciting. Still, sometimes she needed a break too, and even in her current, fragile emotional state, she couldn't deny that she was getting some entertainment from trying to explain her favorite rom-com to them. It wasn't the overall concept that was a struggle, but more the context it was all set in. It was bittersweet thinking about it, but she was feeling relaxed. No, you see, he was late because his car broke down, and the mechanic was. Taija trailed off as the door swung open and Cadsuane strode in. Oh, hello, Cadsuane, said I. Hard eyes in an unsmiling face took in the scene, but she didn't say anything when Taija greeted her with a polite, if slightly cold, smile, So after a moment, Taija just ignored her and continued. Frankly, she'd had enough of the woman anyway. Anyway, the point was apparently meant to be an allegory for the impact of technology on relationships. She found herself slipping into her own language to try to explain. But I just thought it was funny. She heard a loud sniff come from Cadswain, and with a sigh she turned her attention back to her. "Can I help you, Cadswain?" said I. Cadswain took a step towards Taija, her eyes slowly scanning across the room's occupants. This has gone on long enough. There seemed to be genuine anger in her voice, and Taija found herself taking an instinctive step back. "Excuse me." She ignored the irritation flaring up inside her. Cadswain took another step forward, but this time Taija didn't retreat. "This," she gestured around the room. "You are making a mockery of the very concept of Aes Sedai, girl. Did you really think this would be allowed to continue without consequences? Do you think this is funny?" The light of Sedar sprung up around her, far too bright. As Taija had thought, she clearly had an angriel. Taija immediately embraced the power herself. With her own angriel, she had the advantage on strength, although unless something had gone badly wrong with the webs she kept on herself, Cadswain wouldn't know where she stood. Suppressing the bubbling fury within her, Taija kept her response calm. "My name is Taija. You may call me Taija Sedai or Taija Kosola Murnin if you want to be formal, just as I do you the courtesy of calling you Cadswain Sedai." She nearly added, "Despite my doubts about your worthiness for the title." She needed to stay polite. She didn't want a repeat of her conversation with Moirin, where she ended up threatening to kill her. Unhelpful and probably unjustified. Someone needed to be the adult here. Cadswain snorted. She was still advancing on Taija. "Did you think I would not find out your secret? If you had any idea what you were doing, you would know that I can sense whether or not you can channel." She spun a web of spirit and slammed a shield into place on Alexei. He jumped and suddenly looked worried. "I have no idea what you're talking about, but if you think you can walk in and insult me, threaten my friends." On the other side of the room, the light of Sedar sprung up around Nynaeve and Elaine. Taija immediately snapped at them. "Release it now." A moment later, the light winked out again. "This, whatever idiocy it is between me and Cadswain," said I. "You are not to involve yourselves." Cadswain gave her a thin smile at that. "The first wise thing that I have heard you say since I arrived in the stone." Typically, the White Tower would severely punish anyone who claims to be Aes Sedai. However, out of respect for your friendship with the dragon, I will settle for a public apology and recanting of your position. Her body language and tone made it clear that she both thought she was in an utterly dominant position and that she was doing Taija a huge favor. Who the fuck did she think she was? Taija had been working herself to the bone trying to save their whole world from a problem they'd singularly failed to deal with for millennia. She was putting up with the White Tower Aes Sedai claiming a title they didn't deserve. She'd ignored Cadswain's constant sniping. She needed to stay calm. "I have no idea what you're talking about. I was awarded the title. I am Aes Sedai. I have a better claim than you ever will. If you want to speak to me, then show a modicum of respect. Otherwise, you can leave." She couldn't help but muttering afterwards, and preferably fall down a crevice. She was failing at staying calm. "Ah, finally the lamb shows some teeth." Cadswain's smile was predatory. "You think you are so clever, girl, with your little story and your ridiculous attempts at the old tongue. You do not even realize, I know your secret. I have your lover shielded, you have nothing." Of course Taija knew he was shielded, she could see it. Wait, lover, what? Her mind caught up with the implications. "If you try to sever him, I will kill you before you can finish spinning the web." In an instant, Taija's tone went from angry to deadly serious. Cadswain was in her personal space, and Tear had to look up a bit to meet her eyes, but she did her best to convey that she meant every word of it. So much for getting through this without threatening to kill someone, but the voice of reason was fading away to the back of her head behind the rising flames of her anger. Cadswain just smiled at that, irritatingly unconcerned. "You will learn respect, girl. I will teach it to you. Firstly, though, the runaways need to be dealt with. Nynaeve, Elaine, this charade is over. You will be disciplined appropriately for running away, and following that I shall continue your education properly. You will go to my rooms now and await my return when I have finished dealing with Taija Sedai." She layered sarcasm heavily onto the last word. "No." Elaine and Nynaeve hadn't moved an inch, but Taija still said it. "Nynaeve and Elaine are my apprentices. They stay with me unless and until I release them or they decide they do not wish to learn from me. Unlike your White Tower's degenerate version, real Aes Sedai don't need to force people to obey them. We lead, we inspire, and most importantly, we serve. She stepped forward, almost touching Cadsuane. You people squat in the ruins of a once great institution, perverting everything it stood for while you scavenge for the scraps of a civilization you'll never even understand. By the time she stopped talking, she was practically spitting the words furiously. A pretty speech, Taija realized. She'd put Cadsuane uncomfortably close to her, but she couldn't step back now, not without showing weakness. Despite her mocking words, Cadsuane sounded genuinely angry. Every word you speak will only increase your punishment. I would suggest you stop. 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 Who the fuck do you think you are? Taija's world suddenly went white. Why was she on the floor with her head ringing? Did Cadsuane just hit her? Cadsuane just slapped her. Hard. The girls had embraced Sedar again. Taija knew them well enough to see even through blurred vision that they were about to attack Cadsuane. It was hard to think with the absolutely white-hot fury that was roaring through her now, but she just about had the composure to snap at them. No, this is between me and Cadsuane. No title for her anymore. Taija hauled herself to her feet, her head still spinning a bit from the impact. She was well past losing her temper now, homicidal rage burning through her. But no, she wouldn't kill her. However, she was going to make her wish she had. Taija exaggerated how woozy she felt, letting herself stagger backwards a little to create distance. Clutching her head. Was that blood from her lip? She was going to wipe that self-satisfied smirk off Cadsuane's face. Cadsuane continued, her voice oozing smugness. It seems that you do not wish to choose the merciful option I offer. Very well then, Taija spun 5 different webs, all inverted. The woman was too strong to just shield, so she went for her legs with air, for the eyes with spirit and earth, and 3 more webs of air from behind. Shall have to teach you a firmer lesson. Cadsuane continued as if nothing had happened. Taija's webs just dissipated when they touched her, fell apart as if she'd released them. What the fuck? She realized she was just standing there staring when Cadsuane continued. Ah yes, you thought young Alexei could save you. Like I said, I know your secret. He cannot channel for you now. Do not worry, I shall not do anything to harm him, but this farce is over. Cadsuane spun air into 2 webs, one to hold Taija in place, and the other to cane her from behind. Nothing overly harmful, just painful and humiliating. Without even thinking, Taija sliced them with inverted fire and spirit, and Cadsuane jerked as the flows snapped back into her. That might have been the moment to try to de-escalate the situation. Cadsuane had some kind of unknown defense, and Taija had just proven that she wasn't just a victim, but she was too angry. All the stress, the insults, and now this. She couldn't keep it in any longer. Webs of Sedar spring up around her, looming and diving in towards Cadsuane. I'm spending every waking moment trying to save my friends' lives, doing things with the power that you can't even start to understand, you pathetic, half-educated barbarian, let alone copy, and I get this. Taija gestured towards her, words spat out. She bombarded Cadsuane with air, fire, spirit, spinning them together into esoteric webs, although careful to avoid anything actually lethal or that might hurt the girls or Alexei, to try to get around whatever protection Cadsuane had as she went on. Do you even know what I'm doing? What I've gone through? Of course you don't. Taija's webs just faded out of existence when they touched her. What in the light was going on? Cadsuane wasn't cutting them, she wasn't deflecting them. Taija could see what she was channeling. Taija was still talking though, shouting even she couldn't stop. She needed Cadsuane to know what she really thought of her. You just swan around calling yourself Aes Sedai while serving no one. Cadsuane must have had a turngriel of some kind, something Taija hadn't seen before. She was channeling too, throwing a tangle of webs at Taija, splitting her flows multiple ways. Powerful but simple, crude, slow. Taija sliced them. You can't even get out of the way of someone who's trying to help, even just standing aside. Instead, all you can do is interfere, obstruct. Desperate for control, pathetic, you're a perversion of the very concept of being Aes Sedai. Cadsuane started to look worried as every web she formed was immediately sliced. Ha! Do you even know how hard it is trying to do anything with the taint? I'm sitting there trying to work something out when I should have a whole team with me. Except they're dead, every single one of them. Why were her eyes going blurry? I should have an institution, friends, colleagues, Turrengreel. Instead, I'm just left doing it myself. My friends' lives in my hands, and only if I can do something impossible, something even my own civilization couldn't do. Do you even know what friends are? Taija was ranting, but she couldn't stop. Cadswain was throwing a storm of webs at her even while she looked around trying to work out who could be slicing them. So much power, but no subtlety. Taija cut them, noting somewhere in the back of her head that Cadswain still wasn't trying anything lethal, just painful. Cadswain took a step towards Taija. She didn't want her in arm's reach, though, not after she'd already hit her. Taija had stopped bothering to try to touch her with the power it wasn't working, so she grabbed a chair with a web of air and threw it at her, forcing her to stagger back. It didn't seem to move her as much as Taija had expected, though. Cadswain was still limiting herself to multiple webs of air, frustration and anger clear on her face now, Aes Sedai composure failing as she shouted at Taija. You are only making things worse for yourself, girl. Stop this madness. Tell whoever it is that enough is enough. Taija didn't think she could stop even if she wanted to de-escalate things, and she didn't. I hate this time. I hate that everyone I know is dead or worse, and I hate that every time I try to help, I have to work my way around manipulative bitches like you playing fucking stupid games. As she screwed her eyes shut for a second, hoping to clear the blur in them, Taija was vaguely aware that she was screaming in her own language. She nearly missed slicing one of Cadswain's webs before it touched her. Sloppy, failing, just like she had been every day since she linked with Rand. Taija grabbed 3 more chairs in webs of air and flung them at Cadswain hard enough that each of them shattered over her, nearly knocking her off her feet. Yet she seemed to be unhurt. That should have hospitalized her. How many fucking Turrengreel did she have? It was the fashionable hair jewelry it had to be. Another stolen treasure from Taija's time, although she'd never heard of anything that just made webs dissipate. Suddenly, Cadswain was flinging far more serious webs at her. All of the elements mixed in. Taija sliced a web of fire and air that would have burnt her arm off, sliced a blade of air, sliced earth and water sent into the stone floor beneath her feet. It was a storm of Sedar, but she was its eye, untouched by anything. Taija wanted to hurt the smug bitch, make her feel a fraction of what she was, and Cadswain had just taken off the gloves. I just want to go home, not be here finding each revelation worse than the last. With flows of air, she demolished a pair of tables, ripping the legs from them in a fraction of a second, and slammed the now flat surfaces into Cadswain from each side. She thought she could use lethal webs on her without consequences. She'd fucking learn. Why can't I even have the smallest of pleasures without fucking Aes Sedai trying to take them away from me? Why can't I work it out? I don't want my friends to die. Taija whipped the tables hard into the wall, Cadswain sandwiched between them. Wham! Her webs faltered even as Taija sliced everything that came near her. She whipped her back into the other wall. Wham! Back again. Wham! The light of Sedar wavered around Cadswain and the storm of webs around Taija abated. Wham! Taija sank to her knees, unable to stop herself sobbing. Wham! Why were they all like this? Wham! The light of Sedar winked out around Cadswain. Why was everything on her? Wham! She just wanted to see her friends, to find out Tell had never really turned to the shadow, to see a dancer one more time. Taija jolted as her webs of air were sliced and snapped back into her. She looked up through tear-filled eyes, already spinning several nasty webs, to see Rand looking absolutely furious. What in the light are you doing? Stop this madness. His shout was shockingly loud. She'd never seen him look this angry. She didn't even know how to answer. What was she thinking? The girls and Alexei looked terrified, horrified. She needed to get out of there. She couldn't deal with it. Without conscious thought, Taija spun a gateway to her spot on the tower and threw herself through it, forcing it closed behind her before anyone could do more than gape. Taija must have been up there for at least an hour, staring down at Tyr, sitting on the edge of the vertiginous drop. At least the air was fresher up there, away from the smells and sounds of a medieval castle. Her lip was painfully swollen, and she was fairly sure she had a red hand mark across her face. Why was she such a fuck-up? She couldn't help her friends. She didn't seem to be able to handle actual grown-ups. The only people she had any real relationship with were in their 20s at best, and she was failing utterly at dealing with the taint. Everything had made so much more sense in her own time. All she really wanted was to be back home, even if it was in the middle of the war. even if Lanfear had already killed her family. At least she'd had friends, comrades, a feeling that she could actually make a difference. A society that wasn't perfect, but at least felt like it meant something. Somewhere where she could fit in and be valued rather than be the constant outsider. At best, an odd relic of a bygone era. At worst, an alien inconvenience to be removed or worked around. She was just useless here, failing. What was even Tay point? Taija was disgusted at the way her self-control was fraying too. Every decision seemed justified at the time, but she just battered an old woman to the point that if Nynaeve or Moiraine didn't heal her, she'd need months of recovery. Sure, she was provoked, but she was better than that. Better than these people. Taija stared down at the ground a long way below her dangling feet, her hair fluttering in the breeze. None of them understood, not really. Most of the people she really liked, which was painfully few, were basically children. They looked up to her, needed her to be strong, wise, to help them. And she wanted to. Of course she did. She put her life on the line for them. She'd killed her way through small armies for them. It wasn't enough, though. Taija's mind was pulled inevitably back to the sick, slick feel of the taint. To Tell's scarred, snarling face and hate-filled eyes. Was this how Tell felt? Was this what drove him to betray everything both of them had ever stood for? No, there was no excuse. He had friends, supporters, a cause that meant something, a world to protect. Taija crushed the momentary feeling of sympathy. He'd never had to face what she was, and regardless, she would die before she turned to the shadow. It wasn't even a question. She looked down at the ground again. Taija wasn't sure how long she sat there alone in her thoughts. The whole reason she liked this place was that no one seemed to know about it, and anyway they couldn't get there without a ladder or traveling. That was why she jumped so hard she nearly fell off when she saw a pair of hands appear over the edge, shortly followed by Lan's stone-faced visage. Did he just climb up the outside of the tower? Was he insane? He could have died. He wasn't even sweating. Taija's surprise stifled her instinctive response to snap at him to go away and leave her alone, and she settled for something milder. "What are you doing here, Lan?" He finished hauling himself up and sat down beside her before answering. Duty is heavier than a mountain. Death is lighter than a feather. It was that phrase of his that Rand liked to repeat. He didn't look at her as he spoke, just looking out over Tyr like she was. "I don't want to hear it. You don't understand. How can you?" Taija was so tired. Tired of this time, tired of constantly trying, and tired of being alone. Lan didn't answer for a while and then began to speak, his piercing blue eyes staring out at the sky. "I was born in Malkia, into the royal family as the heir to the throne." He took a breath. Even behind his stoic mask, Taija could see he didn't like to talk about it. "When I was just an infant, the Trollocs came. Hordes beyond count descending on my homeland. Malkia's border forts had been stripped bare, a betrayal as it turned out, and the Trollocs overran them in hours. My parents placed my father's sword in my infant hands and sent me south with 20 of the best swordsmen in Malkia. His hand unconsciously dropped to the hilt of his sword. 5 of them survived to see me to Shinar." Taija winced at the thought that she'd nearly decided to go Malkia after reading an outdated book in Keemlin, but didn't interrupt. This was by far the most words she'd heard Lan say at any one time. "I grew up amidst the remnants of my culture, feted as the heir to a lost kingdom, but reminded of what was gone at every turn. My parents' retainers brought me up in the Malkari way, placing the burden of duty on the shoulders of a child. Even today, every Borderlander looks at me and wants to know when I will be raising the golden crane banner of Malkia and leading them back to retake my country. A wasteland that has been overrun by the blight. The 7 towers have fallen, the 1,000 lakes are poisonous and infested with creatures of the blight. The Ale call me man alone because I represent the last of my people. I'm sorry." Taija mumbled. She really shouldn't have been wallowing in her own grief. "I do not tell you this to lessen your own struggles. I cannot claim to understand more than part of your pain and the world you come from. I was not there. I still have some remnants of my people, but I can understand part of it. Sometimes it can seem almost impossible to keep going, but always duty asks ever more." His voice was level, almost musing. Lan continued. "Since I met Moiraine, I have been dedicated to her and her mission. I had not thought I could be diverted from my duty to Malkia, but she had a higher duty. We have spent the last 20 years seeking the dragon reborn because nothing is more important." Randall Thor must survive, and he must succeed. We have given up everything for half our lives to help him, when every hand in the world would be turned against us for it. Duty is an unrewarding mistress with myriad demands, but how can we let it go? Had Moiraine sent him? Taija hated herself, hated this time, for even having to think about that sort of thing. He seemed to read her mind, though. Moiraine has not sent me here to speak to you. If she knew I was here, she would be furious. I am here to speak to you as a Lan Mandragoran, not as Moiraine's warder. Fine. Taija's response was short, rude really, but he ignored that. I want you to understand, your efforts are not in vain. I see the sacrifices that you make, the pain you deal with. Others do too. He huffed slightly. I know you and Moiraine have your disagreements, but even she respects what you do. It can be hard to deal with someone who is so outside one's expectations. Despite her mood, Taija found herself responding. It's just hard. I've barely had time to even think about things. Well, under a year ago, I had a fiancé. I was living in what you call the Age of Legends. Then suddenly, it's gone. Dust blown away by the winds of time. The continents aren't even the same shape as in my time, yet there's always more for me to do. I can't even take the time to mourn because I need to make sure my friends survive, only I don't know if I even can. Lan nodded. When I say duty is heavier than a mountain, it is not a mere platitude. I look at you and I see strength. You will succeed, true blood of a dancer. Taija sighed, and the two of them subsided into something one might, at a stretch, call companionable silence. Chapter 57. Interlude Romans 16. The Modern Perspective. Chapter text Interlude Romans 16. The Modern Perspective. Cadsuane allowed herself a grim smile. Thor had been appropriately warned and reassured. It was time to deal with the biggest problem in the dragon's camp. Taija could not be allowed to continue to undermine both him and the very status of Aes Sedai. She allowed herself a grim smile. The conflict would certainly be resolved once she was done with her. She knew where the girl was, of course. She was always in the same room at this time, teaching the runaways. It would be good to put her in her place, not that she would take any pleasure from it, a necessary chore. She was not a cruel woman, but she was a woman who would do what needed to be done. She pushed the door open and strode in, assessing what was going on at a glance. The runaways were sitting at desks, giggling over something while Taija had perched herself on the edge of a table at the front of the room. Oddly enough, the usually dour woman was smiling. Well, that would not last. Alexei was there too, in some ways an inconvenience, but probably better to nip this whole thing in the bud from the start. The whole scene illustrated the problem, of course. The runaways were just playing around instead of learning or doing chores. Taija looked deeply inappropriate, sat on a table in men's breeches of all things, even loose ones. As for having a man who could channel attending lessons with initiates of the White Tower, well, she had nothing at all to say on that. No, you see, he was late because his car broke down, and the mechanic was, "Oh, hello, Cadsuane," said I. The girl looked over from whatever she was talking about, her smile turning frosty. It was ridiculous that they sat here listening to her as if she had anything worthwhile to say. Was it the way she peppered words of the old tongue into her speech, like a pretentious noble, but without the education to back it up? She was not going to return the woman's greeting. This was not going to be that kind of conversation. Taija continued to witter on, turning back to her audience, when Cadsuane did not answer her. Anyway, the point was apparently meant to be an allegory for the impact of technology on relationships, but I thought it was just funny. Cadsuane spoke the old tongue well enough. She was fairly sure some of those words were just invented. She sniffed loudly. How could the girl sit there with a straight face talking such nonsense? It was incongruous hearing the old tongue from an uneducated peasant, but that would be something she could investigate once this had been dealt with. Perhaps some of the old blood in her. More likely, given her accent in the language and improper behavior, she just learnt some words from a liaison with someone in the past. With a sigh that made her exasperation clear, Taija turned her attention back to Cadsuane. "Can I help you, Cadsuane?" said I. Cadsuane took a step towards her, calculated to be intimidating. She was watching the others in the room like a hawk. She would need to manage their reactions, or this could turn into a real mess. She would at least give the girl the small credit that she made an effort to be polite, even if she did a shockingly poor job of concealing her dislike. Nevertheless, She could feel the anger bubbling inside her, the way the girl marked what it was to be Aes Sedai. This has gone on long enough. Excuse me. Taija took an instinctive step away from Cadsuane. Even if the girl had been able channel, it was doubtful she would have had the strength of character to attain the shawl. Cadsuane took another step forward. It was important to keep the girl off balance if she wanted to end this quickly and painlessly. Still, the way she was pretending not to understand was infuriating. This, Cadsuane gestured at the runaways and Alexei. You are making a mockery of the very concept of Aes Sedai, girl. Did you really think this would be allowed to continue without consequences? Her mind went back to the giggling when she had arrived. Do you think this is funny? Cadsuane embraced Sedar, drawing fully through the angriel among her ornaments. The fool girl did not even react, further confirming her inability to channel. Any sensible woman would have been visibly on guard and embracing the true source themselves if they could channel, or quailing at the sheer amount she held. Instead, the girl just threw more defiance at her. My name is Taija. You may call me Taija Sedai or Taija Kosola Murinen if you want to be formal, just as I do you the courtesy of calling you Cadsuane Sedai. The contemptuous twist of her lips when she put the title at the end of Cadsuane's name was infuriating. Who did this girl think she was? Surely she must know that she was finished, and she was just making things worse for herself. A small part of Cadsuane's mind tried to remember which cultures used three names. Her inability to place the girl's accent truly was irritating. Never mind that. She snorted in disgust at the girl's behavior, advancing steadily towards her. Did you think I would not find out your secret? If you had any idea what you were doing, you would know that I can sense whether or not you can channel. It was time to take action, but first she needed to make sure that young Alexei did not interfere. She wove spirit and pushed a shield into place on him. Too easy, he had not even been embracing Sedin, more fool him. I have no idea what you're talking about, but if you think you can walk in and insult me, threaten my friends. Now the girl was angry. Soon she would realize how much trouble she was in. To Cadsuane's side, the light of Sedar sprang up around Nynaeve and Elaine. She made a mental note to increase their punishment. They were clearly far out of control, thinking to threaten an Aes Sedai, but before she could chastise them, Taija snapped, "Release it now." A moment later, the light winked out again. This, whatever idiocy it is between me and Cadsuane, said I. You are not to involve yourselves. Cadsuane gave the girl a thin smile at that. The first wise thing that I have heard you say since I arrived in the stone. Odd that the girl had known, though. Probably a good guess. A surprise that the runaways listened to her, too. Cadsuane was committed now, though. She dismissed the little warning bell that had started to ring in the back of her head. Typically, the White Tower would severely punish anyone who claims to be Aes Sedai. However, out of respect for your friendship with the dragon, I will settle for a public apology and recanting of your position. Cadsuane felt she needed to make the offer to maintain her relationship with Ulthor, but the girl was almost certainly far too arrogant to take it, not understanding how incredibly jealous it was compared to the normal punishments for impersonating an Aes Sedai. If she had had any sense, she would have made herself scarce the very second Cadsuane entered the stone. When she did not, this became inevitable. The girl did a poor show of hiding genuine anger, or perhaps a good show of pretending to hide false anger. It did not matter. Either way, she replied calmly, but forcefully. I have no idea what you're talking about. I was awarded the title. I am Aes Sedai. I have a better claim than you ever will. If you want to speak to me, then show a modicum of respect. Otherwise, you can leave. She dropped her voice, but not enough, and preferably fall down a crevice. Anger surged through Cadsuane, ruthlessly kept under control as it always was. The sheer arrogance of the girl when she should be begging for mercy, and then adding an insult in the old tongue, as if she would not understand, although it was a poor insult as such things went. Finally, the lamb shows some teeth. Cadsuane gave her a distinctly unfriendly smile, time to put her in her place, reveal what she knew. Then she would crumble. You think you are so clever, girl. You do not even realize I know your secret. I have your lover shielded. You have nothing. Instead of crumbling, the girl looked confused, even as Cadsuane loomed over her. Confused and then furious a second later. If you try to sever him, I will kill you before you can finish spinning the web. She met Cadsuane's eyes, not a hint of fear in them. The alarm bells began to ring a little bit louder. Something was just not right with this girl. Surely she did not actually believe her own story. It must be her own painful ignorance of the world. She did not even know to call them weaves. There was no way that anyone with the slightest idea of what she was getting herself into would look Cadswain in the eyes and make a threat like that. You will learn respect, girl. I will teach it to you. Firstly, though, the runaways need to be dealt with. Nynaeve, Elaine, this charade is over, and not a moment too soon. You will be disciplined appropriately for running away, and following that I shall continue your education properly. No more of this ridiculous rubbish and playing around. They would learn, and with Cadswain's help one day they would be great, not like the soft weaklings the tower seemed to produce these days. You will go to my rooms now and await my return when I have finished dealing with Taija, said I. She could not resist layering sarcasm onto the last word. No. At this point, Taija's denial was not unexpected, but Cadswain noted with annoyance that Elaine and Nynaeve also had not moved an inch. Nynaeve and Elaine are my apprentices. They stay with me and until I release them or they decide they do not wish to learn from me. Unlike your White Tower's degenerate version, real Aes Sedai don't need to force people to obey them. We lead, we inspire, and most importantly, we serve. Taija stepped forward, standing almost nose to chin with Cadswain. You people squat in the ruins of a once great institution, perverting everything it stood for while you scavenge for the scraps of a civilization you'll never even understand. Cadswain was struggling to follow the girl's nonsense. Ruins of a once great institution, what would she even know? More ridiculous attempts at seeming mysterious. A pretty speech. The girl really was furious, practically spitting on her. Made Cadswain furious in turn. This continuing defiance could not be tolerated. Did the girl think she could outbluff her? Every word you speak will only increase your punishment. I would suggest you stop. 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 Who the fuck do you think you are? As the girl slipped into her badly accented old tongue, Cadswain decided this had gone on long enough. She had put up with far too much from the girl, and she was showing no signs of recognizing her true position, so it was time to take action. Crack! The impact of Cadswain's pale hand on her dark face rang out across the room, actually knocking her over. For a moment, Cadswain wondered whether she had hit her too hard. It would be embarrassing to have to heal her. She could not be seen to allow her anger to dominate her actions, no matter how infuriating the girl was. The runaways embraced Sedar again, and Cadswain prepared herself to put them back in their place a bit earlier than she had planned. No, this is between me and Cadswain. Our girl was practically red with rage. Not totally surprising, although Cadswain had hoped for submission rather than more anger. Cadswain watched her haul herself to her feet, tougher than expected. She was staggering, though, and clutching her head. This would be over soon. Still, defiance would need to be punished. It was just a matter of time now, though. The girl had started to understand the consequences of her defiance. It seems that you do not wish to choose the merciful option I offer. Very well, then, I shall have to teach you a firmer lesson. Cadswain watched the girl's eyes widen. She seemed to be frozen to the spot. Here it was, the moment when she would break. Ah, yes. You thought young Alexei could save you. Like I said, I know your secret. He cannot channel for you now. Do not worry. I shall not do anything to harm him, but this farce is over. Cadswain wove two weaves of air, one to surround the girl and hold her in place, the other to deliver her a light thrashing. She would not hurt her badly, but she clearly needed to be educated about the realities of her position. The jolt of her cut weave snapping back into her was both painful and a nasty surprise. Who did that? There was no one else in the room. Alexei was shielded. The runaways were not holding Sedar. Cadswain scanned the room again anyway, sudden nervousness running through her. Had she missed something? I'm spending every waking moment trying to save my friends' lives, doing things with the power that you can't even start to understand, you pathetic, half-educated barbarian. Let alone copy, and I get this. Taija gestured towards her. She looked confused even through her clear anger. Do you even know what I'm doing? What I've gone through? Of course you don't. However disinterested she was in the girl's ranting, Cadswain was not going to just stand there and be further insulted by this girl. Still looking for the unknown threat, she channeled, sending more weaves towards Taija. Yet everything she threw towards her was sliced. But by whom? Where were they? What had she missed? Taija was still ranting while apparently standing there doing nothing. You just swan around calling yourself Aes Sedai while serving no one. Cadswain tied off the shield on Alexei and increased the amount of Sedar she was throwing at the woman, splitting her weaves as many ways as she could, bringing them in from different directions. Every single one was sliced, almost instantly. This was impossible. No one was that fast. Who even was it? You can't even get out of the way of someone who is trying to help, even just standing aside. Instead, all you can do is interfere, obstruct. Desperate for control, pathetic, you're a perversion of the very concept of being Aes Sedai. Surely it could not be a man. Thor had been channeling for months. Alexei was shielded. Without false modesty, Cadswain was as strong as almost anyone in the world, and she had an angriel. No one could be doing this if they could not see her weaves. Surely not. It could not be the girl. She could not even channel. Had she misjudged the situation that badly? Growing horror painted itself across Cadswain's face as she leant into Sedar, feeling the strain from drawing on it as hard as she could. Taija's screaming rant battering at her ears was the girl crying. She would have her crying soon enough if not. Do you even know how hard it is trying to do anything with the taint? I'm sitting there trying to work something out when I should have a whole team with me. Except they're dead, every single one of them. What about the taint? Team? None of this made any sense. I should have an institution, friends, colleagues, Turangriel. Instead, I'm just left doing it myself. My friends' lives in my hands, and only if I can do something impossible. Something even my own civilization couldn't do. Do you even know what friends are? Surely it could not be the girl. It could not be. Cadswain frantically looked around trying to find the other channeler. There was no one. It must be the girl. A Turangriel, painful memories of the Black Hills of Norla sprang up. Fear came with them. Even with the battering feeling of so many weaves snapping back into her, Cadswain stepped forward toward Taija. This needed to stop. She had clearly misjudged the situation. Badly. She clamped down on the fear bubbling up inside her. They needed to stop, talk. A chair smashed into Cadswain with a thump, forcing her to stagger backwards. Fortunately, the impact merely painful, with the six-pointed star in her hair net spreading the impact across her whole body. In frustration, she shouted at Taija, "You are only making things worse for yourself, girl. Stop this madness. Tell whoever it is that enough is enough." She should have paid more attention to Moirain's cryptic warning. They would be having words after this. With a thought, she tried to activate her fish, Turangriel, to pull whoever it was into a link, but there was nothing. Nobody in the room other than her was holding the one power. Tears were streaming down the girl's cheeks. I hate this time. I hate that everyone I know is dead or worse, and I hate that every time I try to help, I have to work my way around manipulative bitches like you playing fucking stupid games. Cadswain had given up on being angry. Now she was just worried about being in a condition to walk out of the room when this was done. Also, she realized, the girl's old tongue was far too smooth through that accent, far too fast. Suddenly, three more chairs flung themselves at her. Far faster than the first, hurtling across the room and shattering painfully over her, nearly flooring her. Those could have killed her. Even with the Turangriel, she might need healing after this. Freed from the constraints of the third oath by the lethal attack, defensive instincts took over. It could not be anyone but Taija doing this, and she was trying to kill her. What a mess she had made of this. She would have to salvage what she could of the situation afterwards, but for now, she just needed to survive. Cadswain smoothly switched from painful and humiliating weaves of air to the full array of her skills. Fire, earth, blades of air. Any of them potentially lethal. She did not want to kill the girl, of course, but it was clear that if she did not use every weapon at her disposal, she would be the one who would end up dead. Still, everything was sliced invisibly, snapping back into her. Only Taija seemed distracted. For a moment she screwed her eyes shut, and one of Cadswain's weaves nearly took her feet from under her before being sliced. Taija was still ranting in that odd accent with occasional words Cadswain did not recognize, screaming at her. I just want to go home, not here finding each revelation worse than the last. The woman was clearly distraught and completely out of control. To each side of her, Cadswain saw a table spring into the air, almost instantly rotating onto its side, the legs shredded from them in moments. It was frighteningly fast, and she instinctively slammed weaves of air between her and the tables. Her blocking weaves were immediately sliced, and for the first time in a long time, Cadswain felt true terror. As the tables slammed into her from each side, with a crunch, She remembered what Taija's clipped accent reminded her of. The man she had fought in the stone, only he had been nothing like this. Then she was flying through the air with no more time for thought. Wham! Pain. Why can't I even have the smallest of pleasures without fucking Aes Sedai trying to take them away from me? Why can't I work it out? I don't want my friends to die. She was flying back the other way. Wham! Her vision blurred. The six-pointed star Terengriel could only do so much. Wham! Overwhelming disorientation and pain she could not keep channeling. It was all she could do to hold on to Sedar. Wham! Her arm broke with a crunch and Sedar fled her grasp. She was flying again. Wham! Something else broke. Flying, she was going to die. Wham! Flying, and then suddenly the pressure around her was gone, leaving her to fall painfully to the floor, an agonizing collapse onto the remains of the two tables. Tears of pain rolled down her cheeks, and it took every bit of Cadsuane's prodigious willpower not to scream when she hit the ground. Rand's furious shout was shockingly loud. What in the light are you doing? Stop this madness. Through blurry eyes, she saw Taija disappear through a gateway and Rand stand over her. His face was hard, angry. What did you think you were doing, you light-blinded fool? He visibly struggled with his temper for a second before getting it into control and gesturing someone over. A second later, Nynaeve joined him, looking down at her. Nynaeve, please, could you heal her? He asked with a sigh. Cadsuane saw Nynaeve hesitate for a moment, and then her face hardened. No, she talked about consequences. She'll live. It'll take a while, but she'll heal on her own, and then maybe she'll learn her lesson. If she gets worse, I'll reconsider it. Nynaeve, please, she cut Rand off with a disapproving look. If she's so useful you can't do without her, get Moiraine to do it. Moiraine had been shocked when a servant had come running to her, asking her to attend Rand immediately. She had been even more shocked when she had walked into the ruins of the room Taija had taken over and found Cadsuane lying on the ground, clearly in a great deal of pain, with Rand looking as angry as she had ever seen him. Clearly, Cadsuane had decided to poke the bear. She would have been more amused if it had not been clear that things had gone much further than she could possibly have expected. This was not the humiliation and loss of position that she had anticipated. It had looked like a full-scale battle had taken place in the room, and Taija had outright tried to kill Cadsuane. Of course, she reflected ruefully that was unlikely to be the case, given Cadsuane was still alive. Rand had politely asked her to heal Cadsuane. His voice had been perfectly controlled, although she could feel the anger bubbling underneath. Of course, she had immediately done so. It had not been a situation she had wanted to insert herself into. She would rather have put her bare hand in a wasp's nest, and the quickest way out was to do exactly as Rand asked without questions. As she had channeled the healing weave into Cadsuane, watching the woman's body repair itself under her eyes, Rand had stalked out, with a brief word of thanks and a command, not a request, to send Cadsuane to his apartments as soon as she was able to stand. The boy was clearly growing into his role, and she was not sure how much she welcomed it right now. It was a couple of hours later that Cadsuane had come to her rooms. Of course she had fetched tea for the woman. It was clear that they needed to talk. Once they both had their tea, they sat facing each other, both perfect models of Aes Sedai serenity. Moiraine took a sip of tea from a cup of finest seafolk porcelain and looked over it with hooded eyes, while Cadsuane took a sip from her own. She let the silence stretch. Cadsuane was infuriatingly composed, her facade back in place despite everything. Moiraine did not think she could have kept her composure so well after what Cadsuane had been through. The girls had been distressingly unwilling to tell her what had gone on, another issue to lay at Cadsuane's feet. At least they had been willing to talk to her before. She could have told the bloody woman that trying to force them away from Taija would not work. Perhaps she should have told her, not that she would have listened. Fortunately, Alexei had been more willing to explain what had happened. He had been absolutely furious on Taija's behalf, but at least that fury had been directed at Cadsuane, not Aes Sedai in general. She probably had the time he spent with Lan to thank for that. Eventually, Cadsuane broke the silence, a small victory. So, the age of legends. Her voice was dry, displeased. Moiraine took another sip of her tea. Indeed, did she tell you? No, Cadsuane grimaced slightly. I might have worked it out afterwards from what she said, but Althor took the time to educate me. Moiraine raised an eyebrow. Educate you? Indeed. It seems he was displeased with my actions and felt that I needed it explained to me exactly what the situation was and how tenuous my position had just become. She was all cool arrogance as ever. Moiraine could not believe the woman could maintain her attitude in the face of what had just happened. I take it you explained the error of his ways to him. Of course the fool woman did. She had not encountered a problem she could not bully her way out of in almost 300 years. Of course I did not. The sudden sharpness in Cadsuane's voice took her aback. I made a grave error of judgment. That does not mean I am completely addled. He told me to consider myself lucky that Taija had given me such a thorough beating, as it allowed him to turn a blind eye rather than punishing me. Her knuckles tightened around the handle of her cup. I nodded, smiled, and thanked him for his forbearance. Moiraine sat back slightly, mind whirling. It seemed she would have to reconsider some of her plans. I see. That is remarkably tolerant of you to accept that from the man. Cadsuane took another sip. I was allowed to labor under the misapprehension that she was an impostor, pretending to be an Aes Sedai. The look she gave Moiraine made it clear who she blamed for that. In part, the failing is mine. I allowed my assumptions to dominate my thinking and lead me into foolish action with potentially disastrous consequences. Are you aware the girl, she hesitated, no woman, has killed one of the Forsaken? Yes. Moiraine eventually nodded. Cadsuane muttered something that might have been a curse. Very well. She hesitated and then sighed. Perhaps I should follow Taija's example and dispense with the word games we have become so used to, so allow me to be blunt. It is clear that you do not trust me. Presumably you believe I may be Black Adger. Moiraine had to hide the surprise at such a blunt statement. She would have expected Cadsuane to explode at even the suggestion that the Black Adger was real. Obviously, I believe this is unjustified, and I serve the light, as I believe you do. However, without a degree of trust, we will fail to work together. Moiraine folded her hands together, not denying Cadsuane's words. What exactly do you propose? We need to reconsider the way that we deal with the woman. I do not ask you to trust me, but I do ask you not to actively undermine me, and I shall do the same for you. Hopefully, with time, you will see that my goals are the same as yours. Ulthor must be allowed to develop, free of anyone else's control, and he must be guided to ensure that he fulfills his potential and is ready to face the Dark One. Moiraine considered for a moment. That is acceptable to me. She was as cool as ever, giving nothing away beyond her words. Good, now we need to discuss Taija, or what is it she called herself? Taija Kosola Murinen. Cadsuane paused. Oh, I just realized why she put so much emphasis on her full name. In the Age of Legends, it was considered a great honor to be awarded a third name. That is why she sounds the way she does when she says it. I wonder what she received it for. Moiraine shrugged delicately. I confess, I do not know. Cadsuane's smile made Moiraine feel she had just walked into a trap. Indeed, and this illustrates the problem. You have clearly severely mismanaged your relationship with her. What do you actually know of her? It was an effort to stifle her instinctively angry response to that, but that would be giving Cadsuane exactly what she wanted, allowing her to turn the conversation back on Moiraine. I hardly think you are in a position to criticize after your behavior since arriving. Deflection. A bit too obvious, though. Cadsuane leaned forward. You have mismanaged your relationship with her from the start. We have a genuine Aes Sedai from the Age of Legends dropped into our laps, one of apparently prodigious power and skill, and you have somehow managed to develop an enmity with the woman. You have not even got the excuse of having provoked her into attacking you. Cadsuane paused, watching Moiraine with an unreadable look in her eyes. Oh, light, you did. Moiraine carefully kept her face impassive until Cadsuane snapped. Come on, out with it. I can hardly take amusement from your misfortune after my own actions. With a sigh, Moiraine explained. Siwan, Sanch, and I, we thought she was one of the Forsaken. Everything pointed to it. I suppose I can hardly judge you for mistaken assumptions. I can see how such a mistake might be made. Perhaps Cadsuane was actually serious about working together. Moiraine had expected her to leap on the point. Siwan and I were linked, and I had my Angreal. We had her shielded. She somehow broke the shield and had us both shielded in turn within a few seconds. She never even blinked. She had to suppress a shudder at the memory. Then Lyndrin walked in. We begged her for help, telling her Taija was Lanfear. She knelt and swore allegiance to her. She said it was an honor to serve one of the chosen. Cadsuane hissed at that. It seemed even her composure could be broken. Then what happened? Moiraine grimaced at the memory. She lost her temper completely and started screaming in the old tongue. At the same time, she grabbed Liandrin with air and simply smeared her across the room. It was so fast I barely saw it happen, just a flash of movement and bloody bits of bone and flesh pasted across the floor. Light. Cadsuane breathed the word without even thinking. Perhaps she was comparing it to what had happened to her. Then she was all brusqueness once again. It is certainly clear that you have handled the woman badly. You will of course do what you wish, but I shall deal with her appropriately. Despite herself, Moiraine had to ask, "Are you sure that is wise? What do you intend to do to her?" Cadsuane's smile was a little frightening. "Do to her, Moiraine? Why, this is exactly what is wrong with your thinking. I shall do nothing to her. I shall apologize profusely for my behavior and offer her whatever assistance I can give her." That was unexpected. "You will, of course. My goals are aligned with hers. Why would I oppose her strength when I can help to guide it? She is alone in this world, clearly dealing with it poorly. She is friendly with Ulthor. If I was able to correctly interpret some of her ranting, she's trying to find a solution to the taint. I doubt it is possible, but she has already proven herself able to do the impossible, so who can say? Either way, she will react better to the hand of friendship than to whatever it is you have been doing." Cadsuane's smile did not reach her eyes. "Remember, Sedar, if you fight it, it will overwhelm you. If you wish to succeed, the first thing you must do is surrender to it." Chapter 58, Interlude Roman 17, Tel V. Asmodean. Chapter text Interlude Roman 17, Tel V. Asmodean. The day after Tel's surrender to Rand, Tel tentatively reached out to grasp Satin. After the agonizing pain that had come from his connection to the Gree, no, the Dark One being cut, he'd been scared to even try for the first day. He had no idea how Rand had done it, but it was what it was. In a way, it was actually very helpful. It left him with no chance of backsliding, and also, he suspected, would make it harder for the Dark One to take revenge. A connection could go two ways after all. Freedom. What a refreshing thought. Or was it freedom? He committed himself to something a long way from what he would have called freedom. With a thought, he seized hold of the raging torrent that was the male half of the power, allowing only a trickle into him. The boy standing over him, distrust in his eyes, and Sedin filling him to bursting, held Tel back from any more than that. Sedin was as it always was, a storm of ecstatic power to be mastered and shaped, but now he wanted to scream, to vomit, to cry. He thought what he'd heard about the taint was an exaggeration, but this was worse than he'd been told. Slick, oily filth oozed over him. He could taste it, feel it in every pore. How was Rand even able to tolerate this? It was horrific. With a shudder, he released Sedin and met Rand's eyes. That was the taint. He couldn't believe he actually stammered. He was too thrown out of sorts by the feel of the taint to even be angry with himself for his momentary weakness. Rand just nodded. Fuck. Death was all he deserved, but channeling that, going mad or rotting to pieces, that wasn't going to happen. He couldn't allow it to happen. In a sudden movement, Tel stepped close to Rand, gripping the man's arm tightly and looking straight into his eyes. He realized a moment later that he could have just gotten himself killed, but that didn't feel important right now. "Rand, listen to me very carefully. This is possibly the most important piece of advice I'll ever give you." He spoke each word carefully, emphasizing how absolutely, deadly serious he was. "I know you don't trust me, and you have no reason to, but please, take my advice on this, I beg you. I want you to go to Taija right now. You need to ask her exactly what it was she did before the War of Power. Make her talk about it, pretend to be curious, tell her you saw it in a dream. I don't care how, just get her talking. Then you are going to tell her about the taint, every horrible detail that you can. I'm sure you've been telling her it's not that bad. Grinning and bearing it and pretending to save her sensibilities is what I would have done. Wasn't that an irony? Don't make her understand in any way you can." "Why would I do that?" Rand protested. "What's the point? It just gives her another thing to worry about, and she's already struggling under everything that's happened to her. No thanks to you." He muttered the last part. Tel shook his head, suppressing a flash of anger. Rand was right. You don't even know what you have in her. He ignored the pain at what he'd lost. No, thrown away. He'd had her support once. You do realize this is exactly the sort of thing she got a third name for, in her mid-hundreds, in an obscure field, while being bad at politics. Do you even have the faintest idea how impressive that is? No, of course you don't. Look, I'll explain that properly another time, but there is no one in this age or the last that I would rather have thinking about the problem. Rand still looked dubious. Just go talk to her now, please. A couple of weeks later, Tell looked defiantly up at Rand, at first meeting his eyes without flinching, but then after a second he looked down. He was trying to redeem himself, not show defiance or assert dominance. The young man was in a foul mood about something, but when Tell had asked what was wrong, he just snapped that it was none of his business. It had rankled, but he hardly had room to complain. Rand didn't trust him, and he couldn't blame him for that. How can I trust you? The younger man barked. I don't even know the half of what you've done. What I do know sickens me. He laughed humorlessly. Yet I'm stuck here, dependent on you for my survival, dependent on someone who betrayed their cause twice over. Tell winced. I've sworn to follow and obey you, Rand. He knew it was inadequate as a response. His word, once a treasure he doled out sparingly, was worth less than mud now. So he sighed and tamped down on the resentment bubbling up inside him. If I was playing some kind of elaborate game, it would be a very strange one. I had you at my mercy, and then I placed myself at yours. I've taught you without hesitation. You've cut me off from the Dark One's protections. I can't see what I could possibly gain from this. He grimaced, other than my faint hope of being able to make up for my crimes. Haven't I obeyed every command you've given me? HRMPH, Rand grunted in response, clearly unsatisfied by Tell's answer. And if I told you to clean my apartments using a paintbrush, would you still maintain your facade of humility? Anger flashed across Tell's face before he firmly strangled it. He had known this wouldn't be easy. I would tell you that there are better uses for me, and then if you nevertheless insisted, I would do it. HRMPH. Rand grunted again and then stalked out without another word. Tell stood there for a moment. How dare the boy speak to him like this, and then just storm out as if Tell had caused him offense. This was more than Luz Thurin at his worst, yet it was no more than he deserved. Before the war, menial labor had been a common punishment for trainee channelers, to illustrate to them that if they were going to waste their instructor's time, their own would be wasted, and because pointless labor was the very opposite of what it meant to be Aes Sedai. He thought back to his own early education in the Power, and the following years he'd spent bouncing between athletics development camps and the tutelage of various Aes Sedai. He'd been a headstrong youth. It enraged him to have the reincarnation of the man he had blamed for so many of his woes speak to him like this. But he needed to suck it up. There was no way back other than accepting the consequences of his actions. In full, nothing else could ever be enough. If he was honest, nothing could ever be enough, but he would do what he could. He'd given up once, never again. He was going to need to find a paintbrush, also a bucket of water and soap. This was going to truly suck. However, Tell would be damned a second time over if he wouldn't do the best job he could do. Another couple of weeks later, so that's enough about logistics. I can see your eyes are glazing over. Tell ignored Rand's scowl. If you're feeling well enough rested, we can work on fine control in channeling. You've got more than enough power, but someone who knows what they're doing will just outspin you with no trouble. The first exercise I want to work on helps develop faster spinning skills. We'll combine it with a new web as well. It's pushing far too fast, really, but I think you can handle it. Shortly after Cadswain's fight with Taija, Tell was angry beyond reason. Did they not know what Taija must be going through? Obviously, he avoided her as much as he could, but he kept his ears open, saw her occasionally from a distance. She was a wreck. This gang of teenagers might not be able to read her. Most of them had the emotional intelligence of a spoon. No, that was unfair, but they were still basically children with all that entailed. Rand had forbidden him from speaking about her, which didn't help. He could see why. The boy wanted to protect her from him, but it still rankled. How did you allow this to happen, Thor? What were you thinking? He was almost spitting with rage, his promised subservience all but forgotten. Can't you see what a mess she's in, and then you let your pet Aes Sedai loose on her? Fortunately, Rand chose to overlook his disobedience of the command not to speak about Taija. He seemed nearly as angry as Tell, in fact, although his anger was directed elsewhere. How was I flaming, meant to know she'd do something so insane? She bloody well decided Taija couldn't channel and went to teach her some discipline. I put a stop to it as soon as I found out. Lucky for her that you did, from what I heard. Tell couldn't help but feel a bit of pride, misplaced as it was given everything that had happened between them. Beating the absolute shit out of what was apparently the top Aes Sedai of this age, who had a Paralys net no less. Taija probably didn't even know what a Paralys net was. That reminds me, we need to think of a way for you to tell Taija about Cadsuane's Paralys net to make sure she knows what's going on there. Rand nodded sourly. Of course. There was clearly more on his mind, though. It's just so hard to know what's going on in her head. She won't talk about her problems or what's bothering her, and sometimes someone just pushes her too far. I've dealt with Cadsuane. I don't think she'll be causing problems with her again. Tell wasn't so sure about that. He'd seen that kind of woman before, but he held his peace and didn't interrupt. It's everything else, though. Well, maybe here was another way that he could make himself useful to Rand and help to undo some of the pain he'd inflicted on Taija. The rage was already fading as he put his thoughts in order. All right, we should probably discuss how to deal with people like Cadsuane, but first, if you want to help Taija, you're going to need to understand her better. I can't tell you everything, but I've known her for a long time. He sighed. Firstly, you need to keep in mind that she's under an incredible amount of stress. She's basically lost everything. Every single one of her friends has been dead for 3,000 years. Her whole civilization, everything she knew, everything she fought for is long gone. I think it's hard to understand for someone who wasn't there. Rand interrupted coldly. Is this a roundabout way of trying to make me feel sympathy for you? Because it won't work. Tell shook his head, stifling a flare of anger. It wasn't an unreasonable thing to say. I made my choices and I'll pay the price for them. Taija didn't, but she's paying anyway. He took a breath and composed his thoughts again. What this means is that she's going to be more prone to sudden bursts of emotion, whether it's anger or sadness. There isn't much that you can do about that, but there are some things. Tell continued with telling Rand what he could about how to work with Taija. It hurt, drawing on his memories of the 15 years he'd spent with her, but that was no more than he deserved. At least the pain was, in a way, cathartic, allowing him to do a small part to improve her life. Finally, you need to keep an eye out for signs that she's hitting her limit. She will absolutely run herself into the ground and then struggle with frustration because she's not concentrating. The warning sign that you need to look out for is that she'll stop talking to anyone that she doesn't have to and just withdraw into herself as much as she can. She'll do the same when she's really concentrating on something, but then she'll often chew on her bottom lip or stick her tongue out a little and look a bit cross-eyed. Best not to bother her then. When it's stress, she'll look like she's trying to curl in on herself and get snappy at small things. If that happens, the best thing to do is feed her some chocolate, give her a hug, and then make her go to bed. Tell paused. Do you have chocolate? I don't think I've seen any. He paused again. Also, she's quite picky about who's allowed to touch her, so be careful with the hugs. Maybe Alexei. He sighed. This was getting silly. Look, the key point is she will absolutely work herself to the point where she forgets to eat or sleep. If she looks like she's pushing herself too hard, make sure someone brings her food and makes her eat, and that she's pushed into bed each night. If you can do that, she'll be all right. Chapter 59. Problem Solving the Age of Legends Way. Chapter text, Chapter XL Problem Solving the Age of Legends Way. The day after Taija's fight with Cadsuane, she woke up emotionally drained. In fact, she was just feeling exhausted, both physically and mentally. As well as the impact of the confrontation, she'd just been working herself too hard. Her to-do list was already overloaded, and now she needed to add working out more ways to get round that woman's bloody Turangriel onto it. She really couldn't rely on being able to cut all her webs like that in the future. Still, there was something cathartic about smashing her into a wall repeatedly. Taija wouldn't lie to herself and say that she didn't intensely dislike the modern Aes Sedai. Well, most of them anyway. There was always Benny. When she eventually hauled herself out of bed and started getting ready to face the world, there was a knock at her door, shortly followed by Alexei holding a teapot and what looked like a pair of buns on a plate. He gave her a smile and placed them down on her desk. Good morning, Taija. Before you do anything else today, you're going to eat the buns and drink the tea. While he was smiling, his voice brooked no disagreement. You don't need to bar. Taija's definitely not petulant protest was ruined by her stomach rumbling. Fine, she groused and poured herself some steaming hot tea. A few seconds later, her mouth full of sugared bun, she mumbled, "Thank you, I appreciate it." It didn't take her long to munch her way through the buns, and after that Taija felt much better about the world. She was more awake and finally felt like she could deal with thinking about the taint again. Maybe she should have a rethink. She'd been pursuing her current line of thinking with no success for too long now. Perhaps Alemhak Tissa's web wasn't the right base for what she wanted to do. The question was, what else could work? Taija was already deep in thought as she went round her lush room collecting cushions and piling them up in an empty corner. However, she still allowed herself a moment to survey her work before she nodded and settled into the nest she'd created. Perhaps if she went back to first principles and then built up from there. It didn't feel like very long later that Taija heard Alexi's raised voice outside her door, although it was muffled by the thick wood. She scowled at the disruption to her concentration, but before she could settle back down, the door opened, and Alexei stepped inside in looking thoroughly annoyed before closing it behind him. Actually, why was he hanging around outside her door in the first place? Cadsuane is outside. His anger made his words short. She wants to see you and isn't taking no for an answer. He glanced at Taija's nest of cushions, but visibly decided not to comment, probably wise of him. She sighed and drew more of Sedar. For fuck's sake, just what I need. Alexei nodded his agreement and turned back to the door. I'll try to send her away again then. No, I'll see her. She's just going to keep on bothering us if I don't, so send her in. Taija definitely didn't sound exasperated. While Alexei turned and headed out again, Taija acted fast. First, she got up and sat in a chair, smoothing her coat down. Then she quickly spun a series of inverted webs. First, a web of illusion to hide her nest of cushions. Cadsuane didn't need to see that. Then around her a number of small objects, coins and bits of jewelry, floated into the air and moved to the corners where they hovered, difficult to spot. If Cadsuane was coming looking for a fight, the gloves would be off this time. She wouldn't leave the room alive. Taija held the items against the wall and ceiling, but with webs on the edge of coming together. All it would take was a thought, and they'd put enough power through the objects to accelerate them to ridiculous speeds. Attacking an Aes Sedai who'd had time to prepare the terrain was never wise. A second later, when Cadsuane came into the room, she found Taija sat behind her desk, fingers folded together and elbows on the table, looking serious and professional. Taija resisted the urge to sigh at the sight of her. She really didn't want to have to talk. If she was honest, she'd probably prefer to just batter the woman into the ground with Sedar again. Cadsuane, she twitched when Taija left her title out. Why are you here? Her voice was blunt and uncompromising. Beyond that twitch, Cadsuane didn't show any sign of annoyance. I wish to speak with you about yesterday, actually. Taija gave her an unimpressed look. Really? I think we both made our positions clear. It doesn't feel like there's much more to be said. Was that all? She sighed. I am not accustomed to this. However, I owe you a sincere apology. My behavior was unacceptable. I was working on incorrect assumptions, but that was not a sufficient excuse. I accept full responsibility for what happened yesterday and wish to say that I am sorry. Despite the sigh, her face was still serene in the way of modern Aes Sedai. Young Ulthor has explained your situation to me, and that you are a true Aes Sedai from the Age of Legends. Taija suppressed a grimace. Why did these people insist on calling it that? Now that I know the truth, it is clear to me that the words I said to you were cruel and incorrect. My only excuse was that I had no idea of the truth. If I had known, I would have welcomed you as an equal and a valued ally. As it was, I thought you were an ignorant youth who could not even channel, seeking power through deception. Taija gave her a flat stare. Would you still be apologizing if it had turned out that you were stronger than me? She didn't blink. I would like to think so. Fine. Apology accepted. Taija was surprised that she'd come to her and apologized like this. Pleasantly so. Maybe Rand made her do it. That didn't mean she had to like the woman, though. Was there anything else? If she was irritated by Taija's shortness with her, she didn't show it. Only that I wish to offer my help with whatever you are trying to do. I realize you will have little trust for my advice, but perhaps I can help in other ways. If I understood you correctly, you're trying to solve the taint. Taija's anger faded as her mind went back to the problem that had been bothering her so much. Yes, I'm trying. She emphasized the last word. Was that a hint of wonder in Cadsuane's eyes? And you really think you can? Even when no one in 3,000 years has been able to make the slightest difference, even when your own society broke before it could be fixed. Taija felt a brief flash of anger at the implied criticism of her people, but Cadswain seemed to be genuinely asking, so she put it aside. I don't know. I don't think things were really the same by the time of the breaking. So many more years of war, so many more dead. Things were already starting to fall apart when Taija trailed off briefly. I need to believe that because, she seemed to understand. Records of the breaking are scant, but it is clear that many of the marvels of the Age of Legends, that name again, had been lost by the end of the war. I cannot truly imagine what it would have been like during the breaking, but I would think that distrust and the sheer level of destruction would have made any efforts futile. Taija shrugged. It was a topic that she hated thinking about. I hope so. I'm one woman alone. In my time, there would have been a huge team of experts working together with resources, Turangriel, and the backing of every Aes Sedai on the planet. She paused. In fact, I think there would have been several such teams both working together and competing to see who could solve the problem fastest. It would have been the entire world united to find a solution. The breath left her lungs in a huff. I won't lie, I really don't know if I can solve this, but what can I do other than try? Well, I will say you do not lack ambition, Taija Sedai. Cadswain gave you a searching look, then continued. I will not claim to have your education in the power, but I am not lacking in knowledge and skill myself. I will put myself at your disposal to offer whatever assistance I can. Thank you. Taija wasn't sure what Cadswain could realistically do, but maybe there was something, even if it was just having a decently powerful assistant to do basic tasks. Cadswain smiled thinly at her. Just let me know. Now I should be going. She turned to leave and then paused. You should be proud of your warder. Not many men will stand up to me like he did. His loyalty is to be commended. Did you bond him shortly after you arrived in this time? Bond him? Did she mean when did he agree to be her warder? I'm not quite sure when he became my warder. It just sort of happened. They stared at each other in mutual incomprehension for a second. I mean the warder bond, the weave that connects every warder to his Aes Sedai. I have no idea what you're talking about. There was meant to be a web. You're saying that Aes Sedai place a web on their warders. Why? Cadswain looked confused at Taija's reference to a web. A weave. I mean a weave, we called them webs. Oh, yes. Taija could tell Cadswain was doing her best not to look at her like she was an idiot. The warder bond allows an Aes Sedai and a warder to feel a small part of what the other feels and gives some additional benefits to the warder such as greater vitality and the ability to sense shadow spawn. An Aes Sedai and her warder can also find each other wherever they are. That felt deeply intrusive. Taija tried not to shudder. So every warder is bonded to their Aes Sedai with this web. Cadswain nodded. Every single one. Did they not have this in your time? She seemed surprised at the idea. Taija shrugged. It seems there are still some new things for me to discover. I've never heard of such a thing. She'd have to talk to Alexei about this. Much as she liked him, there was no way she wanted that kind of intimacy with anybody. So you are not bonded to him? Taija shook her head. Would you like to see the weave? It would seem unfortunate not to be able to share more with your, she searched for a word, friend. Wait, was she implying Taija and Alexei? Couldn't a man and a woman just be friends in this time? On the other hand, she did really want to see the web. That would actually be interesting. Perhaps she really was trying to be helpful. He's just a friend, Taija corrected her. But if you can do it without a subject, then yes, please. Of course. It wasn't immediately clear whether Cadswain meant her relationship status or the web, but she embraced Sedar. Taija tensed, slightly ready to kill her where she stood if she made the wrong move. Fortunately, she just spun a complex web of pure spirit, one of the more complicated things Taija had seen modern Aes Sedai spin actually. Still relatively crude, but ever so pretty. How fascinating, she breathed. Taija was already leaning forward, Cadswain half forgotten, as she studied the web. Mentally tracing the flows through their intricate pattern, she unconsciously murmured her thoughts. So this is probably a quantum tunnel to provide the connection, yes. Presumably that lets them tap into the channeler's strength. Her attention fell on a complex swirl. It looked oddly familiar, and she spoke up a bit. The upper anterior counterclockwise, not connecting laterally to the quantum tunnel. What does that do? Taija glanced up at Cadsuane, who looks utterly bemused. I am sorry, Taija, said I, but I have no idea what you just asked me. With a sigh, she pulled herself back to the current world and tried to imagine she was speaking to a first-year student. This bit here, she pointed at a section of the web. I was wondering what it did. Cadsuane actually looked a little embarrassed, frustration in her tone. I am not sure. I can explain what the weave does, but I have never sought to break it down in such depth. Taija wondered if she could, even if she wanted to, but it didn't matter. It looks a lot like parts of the web for compulsion. Does this bond give the ability to force a warder to do things? She already suspected the answer. Disgusting. Another unpleasant surprise of this time. Cadsuane answered slowly. Yes, it is little known, but it is possible. She saw Taija's expression darkening and hurriedly added, but bonding a man against his will is considered by the White Tower to be as bad as a man forcing himself on a woman. One of the greatest crimes an Aes Sedai can commit. I see. Taija noted that she didn't say whether the men were aware of that part of the bond or how common its use was once they were bonded. She hadn't told her about it until she asked after all. This has given me much to think about, Cadsuane, said I. Thank you for your time. I will consider about how you can help me with the taint. Thank you, Taija, said I. She gave Taija a polite nod before turning to leave again. She was definitely going to have to talk to Alexei about this. There was absolutely no way she would bond him or anyone else, though. What a vile idea. She could probably tweak the web if she really wanted to remove the compulsion elements, but regardless, she didn't want him or anyone else in her head. She should probably have a word with Lan, too. It would no doubt piss Moiraine off if she found out, but she needed to check that he did consent to being bonded. Also that he was fully aware of the potential consequences. Thinking of Moiraine, Taija did need to speak to her too. She really had let things go too far there. She had good reasons to dislike her, but after her conversation with Lan, it was harder to deny that her problems with Moiraine were at least in part due to cultural clashes and misunderstandings rather than a fundamental difference in goals. She probably owed her an apology for threatening to kill her too. Life could be so difficult. She'd do it tomorrow. Enough hard conversations for one day. For now, she wanted to think about the taint. The next morning, Taija went for a run, as she tried to do at least every other day, traveling out to grasslands somewhere far from Tyr. Then after she'd washed and mentally shored herself, up she headed for Moiraine's rooms. There was a pause after she knocked on her door, and then she heard Moiraine's musical voice. Come in. Taija sighed to herself and stood up straighter. Chin up and game face on. Without hesitating any more, Taija pushed the door open and stepped in. Moiraine, said I, sorry for bothering you. I was hoping we could speak. Moiraine's gaze was as serene as ever, but there was a certain coolness in her voice. Of course, Taija, said I. What can I do for you? Taija resisted the urge to grit her teeth. I wanted to apologize, actually. I know we've had our disagreements, but I was out of line when you came to speak to me about Alexei. I shouldn't have threatened you like that. She ran her hand awkwardly through her hair, struggling to meet Moiraine's eyes. This sort of thing was never easy, even in her own time. Moiraine blinked a couple of times. Thank you, Taija, said I. I appreciate that. Other than that, she didn't react. Taija suppressed a flash of irritation. She really disliked modern Aes Sedai's aloofness and serenity. How was she meant to know what to say to them when they barely reacted to anything? The silence extended until she broke it. I was hoping we could clear the air between us. We should be able to work together better than this. I know you've spent your life working to find the dragon, Rand, and have been devoted to helping him since you found him. Equally, you know I'm as devoted to the light as anyone. Yet we try to avoid each other and half the time can barely exchange a civil word. Moiraine didn't interrupt, just sat and listened, so Taija continued, shifting uncomfortably under her gaze as she spoke. I think part of this is cultural clash. I'm not stupid. Taija didn't give her the chance to contradict her. I realize that there are things about the way I behave that are wrong or annoying to your kind of eyes, said I. It's not deliberate. She hesitated. She was trying to be honest. It's mostly not deliberate. But you have to understand that social rules, normality, expectations were different in my time. Equally, many things that today's Aes Sedai do are, or would be, considered extremely poor behavior for Aes Sedai in my time. I'm not saying they're wrong, she hurriedly added, although obviously she thought they were. but it can't help but affect the way I see them. It might be helpful to just sit down and talk about what things we do that annoy each other and how it makes us feel. Then we can explain why we do things. I don't expect either of us to necessarily change our ways, but perhaps if we understand each other better, we can move forward with a bit more harmony. Moiraine just looked at her for a couple of long seconds and then grimaced, the first proper expression Taija had seen from her since she came in. I must say you are full of surprises, Taija Sedai. This solution you offer is perhaps an excellent example of what you have just said. It is not something that any Aes Sedai from this time would ever suggest. Taija opened her mouth to justify herself, and Moiraine held up a hand to stop her. I am not saying I will not do it, just that it perhaps illustrates the problem. I appreciate your apology, in the spirit of openness that you suggest I too shall be open with you. Her eyes seemed to pierce into Taija as she continued. I was attempting to use your own methods when I came to you to speak about Alexei. To talk about the risks in full so that we could have an open discussion as I had judged you would prefer. I did not appreciate the death threats when I was trying to reach out and play by your rules. I know you pride yourself on your receptiveness to logical argument, but your reaction to me was anything but that. A flash of anger shot through Taija. How dare she turn this around onto her? A moment later, she'd ruthlessly suppressed it. She was trying to resolve things like an adult rather than with sniffing and obscure comments. Also, Moiraine did have at least a little bit of a point. Taija nodded and chose her words carefully. That is fair. I dismissed your arguments because they didn't fit with what I wanted to be true, and I shouldn't have leapt to death threats. I'll repeat my apology for that. She'd still kill her if she tried to sever Alexei, though. However, I'd ask you to look at it from my perspective, too. We already had a strained relationship, and you came in and seemed to be trying to convince me that we needed to immediately sever the best friend I have left alive. She certainly wasn't going to elaborate on how terrified of being alone she was even without that. I've spent time researching the taint and your Time's views. She just stopped herself from saying prejudices on male channelers. I understand your perspective better now, but there are other solutions. Moiraine looked away for a second, her lips turning down. Very well. I did approach you in the wrong manner. I should have been clearer that I did not intend to be a threat to your friend. That would make anyone react badly. Talking to people could be hard and uncomfortable, but sometimes it really did work. Thank you, Moiraine, said I. She hesitated. You mentioned other solutions. Cadsuane mentioned you were seeking a way to remove the taint. Do you really think it is possible? There was just a hint of wonder, or maybe hope in her voice. Taija shrugged awkwardly. To be entirely honest with you, I don't know. I think so. I think there must be. There has to be. But the real question is whether I can do it. I think your people gave up a long time ago, but there would have been huge efforts made during the breaking with no success. So, Taija clamped down on the despair that threatened to bubble up. In the end, I have to try because I don't think there's anyone else. I can't just stand by and watch it destroy Alexei and Rand along with every other man unlucky enough to be born with the spark. A noble goal. Moiraine seemed a bit lost for words. Taija wasn't sure she believed she could do it, but then she clearly reached a decision. If there is anything that I can do to help you with it, all you need to do is ask, and you will have my support. Taija doubted she could be of much help, but it was a nice gesture. Thank you. There was a moment of more companionable silence, and then Moiraine sighed. So, back to business. Shall I go first? Without waiting for an answer, she continued, and Taija braced herself for her criticism. For anyone looking for more Watt fanfiction, Tyraniard Overlords on Space Battles has started writing an interesting-looking one based in the Age of Legends during the collapse. A rather more dystopian take than Taija's experience, but the world is a big place, and she was a successful up-and-comer. Do check it out. All legends end, Wheel of Time, discussion welcome. Chapter 60, Interlude Roman 18, Taija's Testing. Chapter text Interlude Roman 18 Taija's testing nearly 3,200 years ago. It was Taija's third annual testing. As with her first and second, she joined the long line of girls in the playground after morning classes. The line snaked all the way around the glass walls of the science block and into the looming brick of the school's main hall. Approximately 70 girls in each year group, 6 year groups of girls to be tested. It made for a long line. However, Adanza Jara Venexa High School was not a school that Aes Sedai sent their children to, so it was rare to find even one girl with the ability to channel from that line, and she would probably be one of the older girls with the ability to learn. Nevertheless, the government required that every child be tested. Taija stood there under the hot summer sun, slowly shuffling forward, eagle-eyed teachers patrolling, watching for any misbehavior. Of course, she was giggling nervously with her friends about what would happen if any of them was found to have the talent, how their lives would change, and what amazing things they'd do. She didn't really think any of them would, but it was fun imagining. I'll become an explorer, finding ruins, dodging traps, and unearthing relics from the First Age. They'll have exhibits named after me in the World History Museum in Paran Disen, Taija asserted, sounding as certain as she always had at that age. Paran Disen felt a long way away, almost unattainably glamorous, but she knew she'd do it, if only she could channel. No, you won't. You'll just want to sit somewhere and read for 600 years. Alisa ignored Taija's immediate protest and spoke over her. I'll be a restorer and heal you from the terrible paper cuts you'll get on your adventures. The whole group erupted into giggles, half stifled at a look from one of the patrolling teachers, while Taija crossed her arms grumpily at the unfairness of it. Pola took the momentary quiet as an opportunity to weigh in. I want to make Terengriel. It would be amazing, changing people's lives and being an artist all at the same time. The girls all nodded at that one. That one was believable and would be pretty cool. Not as cool as exploring First Age ruins, though. The boys had their own line, parallel to the girls. While the girls and boys did most things together, obviously, the power was different. Everyone knew that. The boys would go in groups of 20 or so to stare at a ball of light made with sedin while a channeler felt for a resonance. They'd repeat the test every year into their mid-20s. When Taija wasn't chattering away with her friends, she was watching Gorham, waiting in the boys' line. He was scruffy, but achingly hot. Eventually, in hindsight, Taija would think he'd probably deliberately made himself look unkempt to impress his peers. He certainly wasn't a very good student either way, not like she was. Still, there was something about the way he held himself, his confident, cocky grin, that kept her looking back at him whenever she thought she could get away with it. That time he caught Taija looking, catching her eye and flashing her a smug smile that left her flushing and doing her best to pretend she'd never looked. She was so young back then, only 15 at the time. The girls' testing started at 13, earlier than the boys, and also ended earlier than the boys. Just another oddity of the way the power worked. Of course, at 15, despite their collective bravado, none of the girls expected to be picked out. It wasn't unheard of, but very rare to show the talent quite that young, particularly for someone from their little corner of a danza. Still, the whole of the servants was clear. It would be intolerable for even a tiny number of children to be endangered because they had not been found soon enough, and so every girl in the world had had the honor of being tested every year from age 12 or 13, and every boy from 16. In the vanishingly unlikely event of someone with the spark starting to channel before that, well, doctors kept their eyes open for channeling sickness. Really, all of them were just happy to get the afternoon off classes. The annual testing had always been something of an event for each school, but the main thing from their perspective wasn't the pompous speeches by local dignitaries before the testing began or the half-hearted exhortations from their teachers. It was the early finish. After Taija had been through the testing, she was going to go to her favorite cafe with a couple of her friends and drink iced tea together. The lines slowly shuffled forward as each girl was nodded into the hall. Unlike the boys' line, which moved in jerks as groups went in, Taija's progress was relatively smooth. Eventually, Taija reached the front and went through the wide doors into the hall, nervously smoothing her skirt as she stepped inside. She was pointed to one of 3 booths, curtained off to hide what went on inside, by a dumpy, friendly-looking middle-aged woman she didn't recognize. The curtain was solid black other than the symbol of the Aes Sedai in the middle of it, a full half-meter across. Taija tried to look composed as she pulled the curtain aside, like she imagined an Aes Sedai would. On the inside, she was bubbling with suppressed nervousness. Of course she was. While she didn't expect anything to come of it, this test, or another one like it, could determine the rest of her life. Her mother was a very weak channeler. She never even tried to become Aes Sedai. Her father, on the other hand, couldn't touch the power. On paper, that made Taija a weak prospect, barely better chances than someone born to two non-channelers. However, in her school's rather limited pool, she knew that the gossip had her down as one of the better prospects because of her mother. Inside the booth, a bored-looking, elderly woman was sat at a plain desk with a tablet propped up in front of her. She wore the black, high-collared, formal coat of an Aes Sedai, but unadorned by anything other than the sinuously divided circle on a red square. Taija gave her a deep, respectful bow upon entering. Aes Sedai. She hadn't met many Aes Sedai in her short life, but like every child, she'd been taught the proper modes of polite behavior. At Taija's age, she would only be tested for the spark. The boys' test also detected those with the ability to learn, but for the girls it was different. Testing for the spark required no more than a glance, but more effort was needed to find if a girl could learn, so testing for that would only start from age 18. The Aes Sedai glanced at her tablet. You are Taija Kosola. Yes, Aes Sedai. She tried not to let her voice quiver. The Aes Sedai looked at her briefly, her sharp, blue eyes feeling like she could look straight through Taija to her soul. Very good, thank you. After her momentary look, she made a notation on the tablet, out of Taija's sight. You may go. Taija quickly hurried out on wobbly legs. They wouldn't tell her the result of the test on the spot, even though the Aes Sedai would have known one way or the other as soon as she had looked at her. Taija knew, though. Somehow, as soon as the Aes Sedai's eyes had fallen on her, she'd known that her parents would be called into the school tomorrow, and that her life would change forever.